Chapter 16 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 16. Shadowed Joys. One of the first experiences connected with Ruth's new life was a surprise and a trial. She did not act in the manner as almost any other young lady would have done. Indeed, perhaps, you do not need to be told that it was not her nature to act as most others would in like circumstances. She kept the story an entire secret with her own heart. Not even her father suspected that matters were settled. Perhaps, though, this last is to be accounted for by the fact that Judge Burnham went away, again on business, by the early train the morning after he had arranged for Ruth's change of home and name, and did not return again for a week. During that week, as I say, Ruth hugged her new joy and kept her own counsel. Yet it was joy. Her heart was in this matter. Strangely enough, it had been a surprise to her. She had understood Judge Burnham much less than others, looking on, had done, and so gradual and subtle had been the change in her own feeling from almost dislike to simple indifference, and from thence to quickened pulse and added interest in life at his approach, that she had not in the remotest sense realized the place which he held in her heart until his own words revealed it to her. That she liked him better than any other person she began to know. But when she thought about it at all, it seemed a most natural thing that she should. It was not saying a great deal, she told herself, for she really liked very few persons, and there had never been one so exceptionally kind and unselfish and patient. What should she do but like him? Sure enough. And yet, when he asked her to be his wife, it was as complete a surprise as human experiences could ever have for her. Disconsolate, afflicted, deserted, as she felt, it is no wonder that the revelation of another's absorbed interest in her filled her heart. As I say, then, she lived it alone for one delightful week. It was the afternoon of the day on which she expected Judge Burnham's return, and she knew that his first step would be an interview with her father. She determined to be herself the bearer of the news to Susan. During this last week, whenever she thought of her sister, it had been a tender feeling of gratitude for all the quiet, unobtrusive help and kindness that she had shown since she first came into the family. Ruth determined to show that she reposed confidence in her, and for this purpose sought her room, ostensibly on some trivial errand, then lingered and looked at a book that lay open, face downward, as if to keep the place, on Susan's little table. Susan herself was arranging her hair over at the dressing bureau. Ruth never forgot any of the details of this afternoon scene. She took up the little book and read the title, The Rest of Faith. It had a pleasant sound. Rest of any sort sounded pleasantly to Ruth. She saw that it was a religious book, and she dimly resolved that some other time, when she felt quieter, had less important plans to carry out, she would read this book, look more closely into this matter, and find, if she could, what it was that made the difference between Susan's experience and her own. That there was a difference was so evident, and yet, without realizing it, Ruth's happiness of the last few days was making her satisfied with her present attainments spiritually. No, not exactly satisfied, but willing to put the matter aside for a more convenient season. "I have something to tell you that I think you will be interested to hear," she said at last, still turning the leaves of the little book, and feeling more embarrassed than she had supposed it possible for her to feel. "Have you?" said Susan brightly. "Good! I like to hear new things, especially when they have to do with my friends." And there was that in her tone which made her sister understand that she desired to convey the thought that she felt close to Ruth, and wanted to be held in dear relations. For the first time in her life Ruth was conscious of being willing. "Judge Burnham is to return to-day." "Yes, I heard you speaking of it." There was wonderment in Susan's tone, almost as well as words could have done. It said, "What is there specially interesting in that?" "Do you feel ready to receive him in a new relation?" Ruth asked, and she was vexed to feel the blood surging into her cheeks. I think he has a desire to be very brotherly." "Oh, Ruth!" There was no mistaking Susan's tone this time. She had turned from the mirror and was surveying her sister with unmistakably mournful eyes, and there was astonished sorrow in her tones. What could be the trouble? Whatever it was, Ruth resented it. "Well," she said haughtily, "I seem to have disturbed as well as surprised you. I was not aware that the news would be disagreeable." "I beg your pardon, Ruth. I am very much surprised. I had not supposed such a thing possible." "Why, pray?" "Why, Ruth, dear, is he not a Christian?" It would be impossible to describe to you the consternation in Susan's tone and voice, and the astonishment in Ruth's. "Well," she said again, "it is surely not the first time that you were conscious of that fact. He will be in no more danger in that respect with me for a wife; at least I trust he will not." Susan had no answer to make to this strange sentence. She stood, brush in hand, gazing bewilderingly at Ruth's face for a moment; then recollecting herself, turned toward the mirror again, with a simple repeatal: "I beg your pardon. I did not mean to hurt your feelings." As for Ruth, it would have been difficult for her to analyze her feelings. Were they hurt? Was she angry? If so, at what or whom? Her heart felt in a tumult. Now, I want you to understand that, strange as it may appear, this was a new question to her. That Judge Burnham was not a Christian man she knew and regretted; but, that it should affect her answer to his question, was a thought which had not once presented itself. She turned and went from that room without another word, and feeling that she never wanted to say any more words to that girl. "It is no use," she said, aloud and angrily. "We can never be anything to each other, and it is folly to try. We are set in different molds. I no sooner try to make a friend and confidant of her than some of her tiresome notions crop out and destroy it all." She knew that all this was nonsense. She knew it was the working of conscience on her own heart that was at this moment making her angry; and yet she found the same relief which possibly you and I have felt in blaming somebody for something, aloud, even while our hearts gainsayed our words. It is not my purpose to linger over this part of Ruth Erskine's history. The time has come to go on to other scenes. But in this chapter I want to bridge the way, by a word or two of explanation, so that you may the better understand Ruth's mood and the governing principle of her actions in the days that followed. By degrees she came to a quieter state of mind, not, however, until the formalities of the new relation were arranged, and Judge Burnham had become practically almost one of the family. She grew to realizing that it was a strange, perhaps an unaccountable thing, that she, a Christian, should have chosen for her lifelong friend and hourly companion one who was really hardly a believer in the Christ to whom she had given herself. She grew to feeling that if this thought had come first, before that promise was made, perhaps she ought to have made a different answer. But I shall have to confess that she drew in with this thought a long breath of relief, as she told herself it was settled now. There was no escape from promises as solemn as those which had passed between them; that such covenants were, doubtless, in God's sight, as sacred as the marriage relation itself, and she was glad, to the depths of her soul, that she believed this reasoning to be correct. At the same time there was a curious sensation of aversion toward the one who had, as it seemed to her, rudely disturbed the first flush of her happiness. The glamour was gone from it all. Henceforth a dull pain, a sense of want, a questioning as to whether she was just where she should be, came in with all the enjoyment, and she struggled with the temptation to feel vindictive toward this disturber of her peace. Besides this, she confided to Judge Burnham the fact that Susan thought she was doing wrong in engaging herself to a man who was not a Christian; and while he affected to laugh over it good-naturedly, as a bit of fanaticism which would harm no one, and which was the result of her narrow-minded life hitherto, it meant more than that to him, jarred upon him, and Ruth could see that it did. It affected, perhaps insensibly, his manner toward the offending party. He was not as brotherly as he had designed being, and, altogether, Susan, since the change was to come, did not regret that Judge Burnham's disposition was to hurry it with all possible speed. Life was less pleasant to her now than it had been any time since her entrance into this distinguished family. The pleasant little blossom of tenderness which had seemed to be about to make itself fragrant for her sister and herself had received a rude blast, and was likely to die outright. During the weeks that followed there were other developments which served to startle Ruth as hardly anything had done hitherto. This can best be explained by giving you the substance of a conversation between Judge Burnham and herself. "I ought to tell you something," he said, and the brief sentence was preceded and followed by a pause of such length, and by such evident embarrassment, that Ruth's laugh had a tinge of wonder in it as she said, "Then by all means I hope you will do so." "I suppose it is not altogether new to you?" he said, inquiringly. "Your father has doubtless told you somewhat of my past life." She shook her head. "Absolutely nothing, save that you were, like himself, a lawyer, resident in the city during term time, and having a country seat somewhere. He didn't seem to be very clear as to that. Where is it? I think I shall be glad to live in the country. I never tried it, but I have an idea that it must be delightful to get away from the tumult of the city. Do you enjoy it?" Judge Burnham's unaccountable embarrassment increased. "You wouldn't like my country seat," he said decidedly. "I never mean you to see it, if it can be helped. There is a long story connected with it, and with that part of my life. I am sorry that it is entirely new to you. The affair will be more difficult for you to comprehend. May I ask you if you mean you are utterly ignorant of my early life? Is it unknown to you that I have once been a married man?" There was no mistaking the start and the flush of surprise, if it was no deeper feeling, that Ruth exhibited; but she answered quietly enough. "I am entirely ignorant of your past history, viewed in any phase." Judge Burnham drew a heavy sigh. "I said the story was a long one, but I can make it very brief," he began. "You know that a lifetime of joy or misery can be expressed in one sentence. Well, I married when I was a boy, married in haste and repented at leisure, as many a boy has. My wife died when we had been living together for 5 years, and I have 2 daughters. They are almost women, I suppose, now. The oldest is 17, and they live at the place which you call my country seat. Now, these are the headlines of the story. Perhaps you could imagine the rest better than I can tell you. The filling out would take hours, and would be disagreeable both to you and to me. I trust you will let me relieve you from the trial of hearing. There is one thing I specially desire to say to you before this conversation proceeds further. That is, I supposed, of course, you were familiar with these outlines, at least so far as my marriage is concerned, else I should have told you long ago. I have not meant to take any unfair advantage of you. I had not an idea that I was doing so." "Does my father know that you have daughters?" This was Ruth's question, and her voice, low and constrained, sounded so strangely to herself that she remembered noticing it even then. "I do not know. It is more than probable that he does not. Indeed, I am not sure that any acquaintance of mine in the city knows this part of my history. My married life was isolated from them all. I have not attempted to conceal it, and, at the same time, I have made no effort to tell it. I am painfully conscious of how all this must look to you, yet I know you will believe that I intended no deception. With regard to my daughters, my professional life has kept me from them almost constantly, so that no idea of our home, yours and mine, is associated with them. I have no intention of burying you in the country, and indeed my errand here at this hour was to talk with you in regard to the merits of 2 hotels, at either of which we can secure desirable rooms." He hurried over this part of his sentence in a nervous way, as one who was trying, by a rapid change of subject, to turn the current of thought. Ruth brought him back to it with a question which stabbed him. "But, Judge Burnham, what sort of a father can you have been all these years?" He flushed and paled under it, and under the steadiness of her gaze. I have hardly deserved the name of father, I suppose, and yet in some respects I have tried to do what it seemed to me I could. Ruth, you don't understand the situation. You think you do, and it looks badly to you, but there are circumstances which make it a peculiarly trying one. However, they are not circumstances which need to touch you. I meant and I mean to shield you from all these trials. I asked you to be, not my housekeeper, not a caretaker of 2 girls who would be utterly uncongenial to you, but my wife, and—" She interrupted him. "And do you suppose, Judge Burnham, that you and I can settle down to a life together of selfish enjoyment in each other's society, ignoring the claims which your children have on you, and which, assuredly, if I become your wife, they will have on me? Could you respect me if I were willing to do so?" It was clear that Judge Burnham was utterly confounded. He arose and stood confronting her, for she had risen to draw aside a fire screen, and had not, in speaking, resumed her seat. "You do not understand," he muttered at last. "I have meant nothing wrong. I provide for them, and am willing to do so. I see that they are taken care of. I do not propose to desert them, but it would be simply preposterous to think of burying you up there in the country with that sort of companionship. You do not know what you are talking about. I have never, for a moment, thought of such a thing." "Then it is clearly time to think. If I do not understand you, Judge Burnham, neither do you understand me. My life has been anything but a perfect one, or a happy one. I have gone so far wrong myself that it ill becomes me to find fault with others. But there is one thing I will never do. I will never come between a father and his children, separating them from the place which they ought to have beside him. Never." End of chapter 16. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 17 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 17. Duty's Burden. By degrees, Judge Burnham began to understand the woman whom he had chosen for his wife. Hitherto he had been in the habit of being governed by his own will, of bending forces to his strong purposes. Those occasional characters with whom he came in contact who refused to be molded by him, he had good-naturedly let alone, crossing their path as little as possible, and teaching himself to believe that they were not worth managing, which was the sole reason why he did not manage them. But Ruth Erskine was a new experience. She would do what she believed to be the right thing, and she would not yield her convictions to be governed by his judgment. He could not manage her, and he had no wish to desert her. Clearly one of them must yield. The entire affair served to keep him in a perturbed state of mind. Ruth grew more settled. Weeks went by, and her decisions were made, her plans formed, and she walked steadily toward their accomplishment. Not realizing it herself, she was yet engaged in making a compromise with her conscience. She believed herself, perhaps, to have done wrong in promising to become the wife of a man who ignored the principle which governed her life. She would not give back that promise, but she would make the life one of self-abnegation, instead of, what for one brief week it had seemed to her, a resting place, full of light. She would be his wife, but she would also be the mother of his daughters. She would live with them, for them, give up her plans, her tastes, her pursuits, for their sake. In short, she would assume the martyr's garb in good earnest now, and wear it for a lifetime. The more repulsive this course seemed to her, and it grew very repulsive indeed, the more steadily she clung to it, and it was not obstinacy, you are to understand. It will do for such as Judge Burnham to call such resolves by that name, but you should know that Ruth Erskine was all the time governed by a solemn sense of duty. It was a cross, hard, cold, unenlightened by any gleams of peace, but for all that it started in a sense of duty. By degrees the long story, much of it, came to light, rather was dragged to light, by a persistent method of cross-questioning which drove Judge Burnham to the very verge of desperation. "Judge Burnham," she would begin, "how have your daughters been cared for all these years?" "Why," he said, wriggling and trying to get away from his own sense of degradation, "they had good care; at least I supposed it was. During their childhood their mother's sister lived there and took the sole charge of them. She was a kind-hearted woman enough, and did her duty by them." "But she died, you told me, when they were still children." "Yes, that was when I was abroad. You see, when I went I expected to return in a year at most, but I stayed on, following one perplexing tangle after another in connection with my business affairs, until 4 or 5 years slipped away. Meantime their aunt died, and the old housekeeper, who had lived with their family since the last century sometime, took her place, and managed for them as well as she could. I didn't realize how things were going. I imagined everything would come out right, you know." "I don't see how they could," Ruth said, coldly, and Judge Burnham answered nothing. "Didn't they attend school?" "Why, yes, they went to the country school out there, you know, when there was one. It is too near the city to secure good advantages, and yet too far away for convenience. I meant, you see, to have them in town, when I came home, at the best schools, and boarding with me, but I found it utterly impracticable, utterly so. You have no conception of what 5 years of absence will do for people." "I can imagine something of what 5 years of neglect would do." Ruth said it icily, as she could speak. Then he would say, "Oh, Ruth," in a tone which was entreating and almost pitiful. And he would start up and pace back and forth through the room for a moment, until brought back by one of her stabbing questions. "How have they lived since your return?" "Why, right there, just where they always have lived. It is the only home they have ever known." "And are they entirely alone?" "Why, no, the housekeeper, of whom I told you, had a daughter, a trustworthy woman, and when her mother died this daughter moved to the house with her family, and has taken care of them." "And so, Judge Burnham, your 2 daughters have grown to young ladyhood, isolated from companionship, and from education, and from refinements of any sort, even from their own father, and have been the companions of ignorant hirelings." "I tell you, Ruth, you must see them before you can understand this thing," he would exclaim in almost despair. "I assuredly mean to," would be her quiet answer, which answer drove him nearer to desperation than he was before. At last he came and stood before her. "You force me to speak plainly," he said. "I would have shielded you forever, and you will not let me. These girls are not like your class of girls. They have no interest in refined pursuits. They have no refinement of feeling or manner. They have no desire for education. They do not even care to keep their persons in ordinarily tasteful attire. They care nothing for the refinements of home. They belong to a lower order of being. It is simply impossible to conceive of them as my children. And it is utterly preposterous to think of your associating with them in any way." She was stilled at last; stunned, it would seem, for she sat in utter silence for minutes that seemed to him hours, while he stood before her and waited. When at last she spoke, her voice was not so cold as it had been, but it was controlled and intensely grave. "And yet, Judge Burnham, they are your children, and you are bound to them by the most solemn and sacred vows which it is possible for man to take on his lips. How can you ever hope to escape a just reward for ignoring them? Now, I must tell you what I feel and mean. I do not intend to be hard or harsh, and yet I intend to be true. I am not sure that I am acting or talking as other girls would, under like circumstances, but that is a question which has never troubled me. I am acting in what I believe to be the right way. You have asked me to be your wife, and I have promised in good faith. It was before I knew any of this story, which, in a sense, alters the ground on which we stood. I will tell you plainly what I believe I ought to do, and what, with my present views, I must do. I will give my life to helping you in this matter. I will go up to that home of yours and hide myself with those girls, and we will both do what we can to retrieve the mistakes of a lifetime. I will struggle and plan and endure for them. I am somewhat versed in the duties which this sort of living involves, as you know, and in the crosses which it brings. Perhaps it was for this reason they were sent to me. I have chafed under them and been weak and worthless, God knows, and yet I feel that perhaps he is giving me another chance. I will try to do better work for him in your home than I have in my own. At any rate, I must try. If I fail, it shall be after the most solemn and earnest efforts that I can make. But, as I said, it must be tried. It is not all self-sacrifice, Judge Burnham. I mean that I could not do it, would not see that I had any right to do it, if I had not given my heart to you, and if for the love of you I could not trust myself to help you in your duty. But you must fully understand that it seems unquestionably to be your duty. You must not shirk it. I must never help you to shirk it. I should not dare. I will go with you to that home and be with you a member of that family. But I can never make with you another home that does not include the family. I must never do it." Judge Burnham hoped to turn her away from this decision, which was, to him, simply an awful one. Do you imagine that he accomplished it? I believe you know her better. It is necessary for you to remember that he did not understand the underlying motive by which she was governed. When she said, "I must not do it," he did not understand that she meant her vows to Christ would not let her. He believed, simply, that she set her judgment above his in this matter, and determined that she would not yield it. The struggle was a severe one. At times he felt as though he would say to her, if she must not share with him the home he had so lovingly and tenderly planned for her, why, then, he must give her up. The only reason he did not say this was because he did not dare to try it. He had not the slightest intention of giving her up. And he was afraid that she would take him at his word, as assuredly she would have done. She was dearer to him, in her obstinacy, than anything in life, and nothing must be risked. Therefore he was sore beset, and, as often as he renewed the struggle, he came off worsted. How could it be otherwise, when Ruth could constantly flee back to the unanswerable position, "Judge Burnham, it is wrong. I must not do it." What if he didn't understand her? He saw that she understood herself, and meant what she said. So it came to pass that, as the days went by, and the hour for the marriage drew nearer and nearer, Judge Burnham felt the plans, so dear to his heart, slipping away from under his control. Ruth would be married. Well, that was a great point gained. But she would not go away for a wedding journey. She would not go to the Grand Hotel, where he desired to take rooms. No, not for a day or hour. She would not have the trial of contrast between the few, first bright days of each other, and the dismal days following, when they had each other, with something constantly coming between. She would go directly to that country home, and nowhere else. She would go to it just as it was. He was not to alter the surroundings or the outward life in one single respect. She meant to see the home influence which had molded those girls exactly as it had breezed about them, without any outside hand to change it. She proposed to do the changing herself. One little bit of compromise her stern conscience admitted. Her future husband might fit up one room for her use, her private retreat, according to his individual taste, and she would accept it from him as hers. But the outer life that was to be lived as a family he must not touch. "But, Ruth," he said, "you do not understand. Things have utterly gone to decay. There was no one to care or appreciate. There was no one to take care of anything, and I let everything go." "Very well," she said, "then we will see what our united tastes can do toward setting everything right, when we come to feel what is wanted." "Then couldn't you go with me and see the place, a few weeks before we go there, and give directions, such as you would like to see carried out? Just a few, you know, such as you can take in at a glance, to make it a little more like home?" She shook her head decidedly. No, indeed. She was not going there to spy out the desolation of the land. She was going to it as a home, and, if as a home it was defective, together they, he, his daughters and herself, would see what was needed and remodel it. How dismally he shook his head over that. He knew his daughters, and she did not. He tried again. "But, Ruth, it is 5 miles from the railroad. How will it be possible to ride 10 miles by train and 5 by carriage, night and morning, and attend to business?" "Easily," she said quietly, "except in term time. The busiest season that my father ever had we were in the country, and he came out nearly every evening. In term time we must all come into town and board, I suppose." He winced over this and was silent, and felt himself giving up his last hope of holding this thing in check, and began to realize that he loved this future wife of his very much indeed, else he would never submit to such a state of things. He believed it would last for but a little while, just long enough for her to see the hopelessness of things; but this seeing, with her, into all its hopelessness, was what he shrank from. So the days went by, not much joy in them for any one concerned. Away from Ruth's influence, Judge Burnham was annoyed to such a degree that he could hardly make a civil answer to the most ordinary question, and his office clerks grumbled among themselves that, if it made such a bear of a man to know that in 3 weeks he was to have a wife, they hoped their turn would never come. Away from his presence, Ruth was grave to a degree that threw an added shadow over the home life. Susan felt herself to be in disgrace with her sister, and had been unable thus far to rise above it and be helpful, as she would have liked to be. Judge Erskine, hearing more details from his friend than from his daughter, sympathized with her strong sense of duty, honored her, rejoiced in her strength of purpose, and was sorry for her, realizing more than before what a continuous chain of trial her life had been of late. Therefore, his tone was tender and sympathizing when he spoke to her, but sad as one who felt too deeply, and was not able to impart strength. As for Mrs. Erskine, she had so much to say about the strangeness of it all, wondering how Judge Burnham could have managed to keep things so secret, and how the girls looked, whether they favored him or their ma, and whether they would be comfortable sort of persons to get along with, that Ruth was driven to the very verge of distraction, and felt at times that, to get out of that house into any other on earth, would be a relief. There was much ado, also, about that wedding. Mrs. Erskine wanted marvelous things, an illumination, and a feast, and a crowd, and all the resources of the rainbow, as to bridal toilet. But here, as in other matters, Ruth held steadily to her own way, and brought it to pass, a strictly private wedding, in the front parlor of her father's house, not a person, outside of the Erskine family circle, to witness the ceremony, save Marian Dennis. She, by virtue of being Dr. Dennis's wife, gained admission. But Marian Dennis's tears fell fast behind the raised handkerchief, which shielded her face during the solemn prayer. She knew, in detail, some of Ruth's plans. She knew, better than Ruth did, so she thought, that plans are sometimes hard to carry out. How many she had indulged, and, at this moment, there sat at home her haughty daughter, Grace, entirely unforgiving, because of her meddling, so she styled the earnest attempts to shield her from danger. To Marian, Ruth's future had never looked less hopeful than it did on this marriage morning. It may be that her own disappointments caused some of the flowing tears, but her heart ached for Ruth. What should she do without a Christian husband, a husband entirely in sympathy with every effort, and entirely tender with every failure of hers? What was Ruth to do with Judge Burnham for a husband, instead of Dr. Dennis? How were the trials of life to be borne with any man living except this one? Thus reasoned silly Marian, unconsciously indeed, but that was as it seemed to her. Well for Ruth, that even at this moment she could look into the face of the man whom she had chosen and feel, It is, after all, for him. There is no other person for whom I could begin this life," said a friend, the other day, in sympathetic tones, as she spoke of a young bride going far from her home and her mother, "I feel so sorry for her. It is such a trying experience, all alone, away from her early friends." "But," I said, "after all, she doesn't go as far as you told me you did, when you were married." The answer was quick. "Oh, no, but then I had my husband, you know, and she—" and then she stopped to laugh. So it was a blessed thing that Ruth Burnham, going out from the home which had sheltered her, felt that she went with her husband. Chapter 18. Of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 18. Embarrassment and Merriment. I suppose there was never a bride going out from her home with her husband who was more silent than was our Ruth. It was the silence of constraint, too. It was such a little journey, 10 miles or so by train, then 5 by carriage, and then, what were they coming to? If only it had been her husband's happy home, where treasures were waiting to greet him, and be clasped to his heart, Ruth felt that it would have been so much easier. Yet, I think, very likely, she did not understand her own heart. Probably the easiest excuse that we can make for ourselves, or for our shrinking from duties is, "If it were only something else, I could do it." I think it quite likely that had Ruth been going to just such a home as she imagined would make her cross lighter, she would have been jealous of those clasping hands and tender kisses. The human heart is a strange instrument, played upon in all sorts of discords, even when we think there is going to be music. As it is, the certainty of her husband's disapproval, the sense of strangeness, and the sense of shrinking from the new trials, and the questioning as to whether, after all, she had done right, all served to depress Ruth's heart and hush her voice, to such a degree that she felt speech was impossible. I want to linger a minute over one sentence, the questioning as to whether, after all, she had done right. There is no more miserable state of mind than this. It is such dreadful ground for the Christian to occupy. Yet, practically, half the Christians in the world are there. Theoretically, we believe ourselves to be led, even in the common affairs of life, by the all-wise Spirit of God. Theoretically, we believe that He can make no mistake. Theoretically, we believe that it is just as easy to get an answer from that Spirit, a word behind thee, as the Bible phrases it, directing us which way to go, as it is to hear our human friend answer to our call. But practically, what do we believe? What is the reason that so much of our life is given up to mourning over possible mistakes? Is it because we choose to decide some questions for ourselves without bringing them to the test of prayer? Or because, having asked for direction, we failed to watch for the answer or expect it, and so lost the "still small voice"? Or is it, sometimes, because having heard the voice, we regret its direction and turn from it and choose our own? Ruth Burnham was conscious of none of these states. She had prayed over this matter. Indeed, it seemed to her that she had done little else than pray, of late; and, in some points, she was strong, feeling that her feet had been set upon a rock. But in others there was, at this too late moment, a sense of faltering. Might she not, asked her conscience of her, have yielded somewhat? Would it have worked any ill for them both to have gone away from everything for a few weeks, as Judge Burnham so desired to do, and have learned to know and help each other, and have learned to talk freely together about this new home, and have grown stronger together before facing this manifest duty? I do not tell you she might have done all this. Perhaps her first position, that it would have been unwise and unhelpful, was the right one. I think we do, sometimes, put added touches of our own to the cross that the Father lays upon us, making it shade in gloom, when he would have tinted it with sunlight. But I do not say that Ruth had done this. I don't know which was wise. What I am sure of is, that she, having left it to Christ, having asked for his direction, and having received it, for unless she thought she had been shown the step to take, assured she ought not to have stepped, she had no right to unrest herself and strap on to her heart the burden of that wearying question, Did I, after all, do right? Judge Burnham could match her in quietness. He had her beside him at last. She was his wife. She bore his name. Henceforth their interests were one. Thus much of what he had months ago set himself steadily to accomplish had been accomplished. But not a touch of the details was according to his plans. The situation in which he found himself was so new and so bewildering, that while he meant, for her sake, to make the best of it until such a time as she could see that she was wrong and he was right, yet, truth to tell, he hardly knew how to set about making the best of it. He did what he could. No topic of conversation that suggested itself to his mind seemed entirely safe. And beside, what use to try to converse for so short a journey? So he contented himself with opening her car window, and dropping her blind, and arranging her traveling shawl comfortably for a shoulder support, and in other nameless, thoughtful ways making this bit of a journey bright with caretaking tenderness. It served to show Ruth how royally he would have cared for her in the longer journey which he wanted, and which she wouldn't have. Whereupon she immediately said to her heart, Perhaps it would have been better if I had yielded. And that made her miserable. There was no time to yield now. The station was called out, and there was bustle and haste and no little nervousness in getting off in time, for the train seemed, before it fairly halted, to have been sorry for that attempt at accommodation, and began to show signs of going on again that were nerve-distracting. It annoyed Judge Burnham to the degree that he said, savagely, to the conductor, "It was hardly worth while to stop if you can't do it more comfortably." He would have liked so much to have been leisurely and comfortable, to have done everything in a composed, traveled manner. He understood so thoroughly all the details of traveled life. Why could he not show Ruth some of the comforts of it? That little station! It was in itself a curiosity to Ruth. She had not supposed that 10 miles away from a city anything could be so diminutive. A long, low, unpainted building, with benches for seats, and loungers spitting tobacco juice for furniture. There was evidently something unusual to stare at. This was the presence of a quiet, tasteful carriage, with handsome horses, and a driver who indicated, by the very flourish of his whip, that this was a new locality to him. He and his horses and his carriage belonged, unmistakably, to city life, and had rarely reached so far out. "Is this your carriage?" Ruth asked, surveying it with a touch of satisfaction as Judge Burnham made her comfortable among the cushions. "No, it is from town. There are no carriages belonging to this enlightened region." "How do your family reach the station, then?" "They never reach it," he answered, composedly. He had resolved upon not trying to smooth over anything. "But how did you get to and from the cars when you were stopping here?" "On the rare occasions when I was so unfortunate as to stop here, I sometimes caught the wagon which brings the mail and takes unfortunate passengers. Or, if I were too early for that, there were certain milk carts and vegetable carts which gave me the privilege of a ride, with a little persuasion in the shape of money." Nothing could be more studiedly polite than Judge Burnham's tone, but there was a covert sarcasm in every word he said. He seemed to Ruth to be thinking, "I hope you realize the uncomfortable position into which your obstinacy has forced me." Evidently not a touch of help was to be had from him. What were they to talk about during that 5 miles of travel over a rough road? Ruth studied her brains to try to develop a subject that would not make them even more uncomfortable than they now felt. She was unfortunate in selection, but it seemed impossible to get away from the thoughts which were just now so prominently before them. She suddenly remembered a fact which surprised her, and to which she gave instant expression. "Judge Burnham, what are your daughters' names?" The gentleman thus addressed wrinkled his forehead into a dozen frowns, and shook himself, as though he would like to shake away all remembrance of the subject, before he said, "Their very names are a source of mortification to me. The elder is Seraphina, and the other Araminta. What do you think of them?" Ruth was silent and dismayed. This apparently trivial circumstance served to show her what a strange state of things existed in the home whither she was going. She didn't know how to answer her husband's question. She was sorry that she had asked any. There seemed no way out but to ask another, which, in truth, pressed upon her. "How do you soften such names? What do you call them when you address them?" "I call them nothing. I know of no way of smoothing such hopeless cognomens, and I take refuge in silence or bewildering pronouns." Ruth pondered over this answer long enough to have her courage rise, and to grow almost indignant. Then she spoke again. "But, Judge Burnham, I do not see how you could have allowed so strange a selection for girls in this age of the world. Why didn't you save them from such a lifelong infliction? Or, was there some reason for the use of these names that dignifies them, that makes them sacred?" "There is this sole reason for the names, and for many things which you will find yourself unable to understand. Their mother was a hopeless victim to fourth-rate sensation novels, and named her daughters from that standpoint. I was in reality powerless to interfere. You may have discovered before this that I am not always able to follow out the dictates of my own judgment, and others, as well as myself, have to suffer in consequence." What could Ruth answer to this? She felt its covert meaning, and so sure was she beginning to feel that she had followed her own ideas, instead of the leadings of any higher voice, that she had not the heart to be offended with the plainness of the insinuation. But she realized that it was a strange conversation for a newly made husband and wife. She took refuge again in silence. Judge Burnham tried to talk. He asked if the seat she occupied was entirely comfortable, and if she enjoyed riding, and if she had tried the saddle, or thought she would enjoy such exercise, and presently he said, "These are abominable roads. I am sorry to have you so roughly treated in the very beginning of our journey together. I did not want roughness to come to you, Ruth. I thought that you had endured enough." She was sorry that he said this. Her tears were never nearer the surface than at this moment, and she did not want to shed them. She began to talk rapidly to him about the beauty of the far-away hills which stretched bluely before them, and he tried to help her effort and appreciate them. Still, it was too apparent just then neither cared much for hills, and it was almost a relief when the carriage at last drew up under a row of elms. These at least were beautiful. So was the long, irregular, grassy yard that stretched away up the hill, and was shaded by noble old trees. It required but a moment to dismiss the carriage, and then her husband gave her his arm, and together they toiled up the straggling walk toward the long, low building, which was in dire need of paint. "This yard is lovely," Ruth said, and she wondered if her voice trembled very much. "I used to like the yard 100 years or so ago," he answered sadly. "It really seems to me almost as long ago as that since I had any pleasant recollections of anything connected with it." "Was it your mother's home?" "Yes," he said, and his face grew tender. "And she was a good mother, Ruth. I loved the old house once for her sake." "I think I can make you love it again for mine." Ruth said the words gently, with a tender intonation that was very pleasant to hear, and that not many people heard from her. Judge Burnham was aware of it, and his grave face brightened a little. He reached after her hand, and held it within his own, and the pressure he gave it said what he could not speak. So they went up the steps of that low porch with lighter hearts, after all, than had seemed possible. The door at the end of that porch opened directly into the front room, or keeping room, as, in the parlance of that region of country, it was called, though Ruth did not know it. The opening of that door was a revelation to her. She had never been in a real country room before. There were green paper shades to the windows, worn with years and faded, and little twinkling rays of the summer sunshine pushed in through innumerable tiny holes, which holes, curiously enough, Ruth saw and remembered, and associated forever after with that hour and moment. There was a rag carpet on the floor, of dingy colors and uneven weaving. Ruth did not even know the name of that style of carpet, but she knew it was peculiar. There were cane-seated chairs, standing in solemn rows at proper intervals. There was a square table or stand, if she had but known the proper name for it, covered with a red cotton cloth having a gay border and fringed edges. There was a wooden chair or two, shrinking back from contact with the smarter, cane-seated ones, and there was a large, old-fashioned, high-backed wooden rocker, covered back and arms and sides, with a gay patchwork cover, aglow with red and green and yellow, and, it seemed to poor Ruth, 100 other dazzling colors, and the whole effect reminded her forcibly of Mrs. Judge Erskine. Now you have a list of every article of furniture which this large room contained. No, I forget the mantelpiece, though Ruth did not. It was long and deep and high, and was adorned with a curious picture or two, which would bear studying before you could be sure what they were, and with 2 large, bright, brass candlesticks, and a tray and snuffers. Also, in the center, a fair-sized kerosene lamp, which looked depraved enough to smoke like a furnace, without even waiting to be lighted. Also, there were some oriental paintings in wooden frames on the wall. Are you so fortunate as not to understand what oriental paintings are? Then you will be unable to comprehend a description of Ruth's face as her eye rested on them. Judge Burnham was looking at her as her eye roved swiftly and silently over this scene, not excepting the curious paper, with which the walls were hung in a pattern long gone by. He stood a little at one side, affecting to raise an unmanageable window sash. They were all unmanageable, but in reality he was watching her, and I must confess to you that this scene, contrasted in his mind with the elegant home which his wife had left, was fast taking a ludicrous side to him. The embarrassments were great, and he knew that they would thicken upon him, and yet the desire to laugh overcame all other emotions. His eyes danced, and he bit his lips to restrain their mirth. But at last, when Ruth turned and looked at him, the expression in her face overcame him, and he burst forth into laughter. It was a blessed thing for Ruth that she was able to join him. "Sit down," he said, wheeling the gay rocker toward her. "I am sure you never occupied so elegant a seat before. There is a great gray cat belonging to the establishment who usually sits in state here, but she has evidently vacated in your favor today." Ruth sank into the chair, unable to speak. The strangeness of it all, and the conflicting emotions stirring in her heart, fairly took away the power of speech. Judge Burnham came and stood beside her. "We have entered into this thing, Ruth," he said, and his voice was not so hard as it had been, "and there are embarrassments enough certainly connected with it, and yet it is a home, and it is our home, yours and mine, and we are together forever. This, of itself, is joy enough to atone for almost anything." She was about to answer him, and there was a smile on her face, in the midst of tears in her eyes, but they were interrupted. The door opened suddenly, and an apparition in the shape of a child, perhaps 5 years old, appeared to them, a tow-headed child, with staring blue eyes and wide-open mouth, a child in a very pink dress, not over clean and rather short, a child with bare feet, and with her arms full of a great gray cat. She stared amazingly at them for a moment, then turned and vanished. "That is not mine, at least," Judge Burnham said, and the tone in which he said it was irresistible. His eyes met Ruth's at that moment, and all traces of tears had disappeared, also all signs of sentiment. There was but one thing to do, and they did it, and the old house rang with peal after peal of uncontrollable laughter. End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 19 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 19. My Daughters. The room to which Judge Burnham presently escorted his bride was very unlike that parlor. As she looked about her, on the exquisite air of beauty which prevailed, and the evidences of refined and cultured taste scattered with lavish hand, she was touched with the thought that her tastes had been understood and remembered in each minute detail. "How very lovely this is!" she said, as her foot rested on the soft velvet carpet, with its wildwood vines trailing in rich colors over the floor. "I knew you would like it," Judge Burnham said with a gratified smile. "It reminded me of you, and, indeed, the entire room has seemed to me to be full of your presence. I enjoyed arranging it. I think I could have gratified your tastes in regard to the rest of the house, Ruth, if you had let me." "Oh, I know you could," she answered, earnestly. "It was not that I did not trust your taste, and perhaps I made a mistake, but I meant it right, and you must help me to bring right out of it." She did not realize it, but this little concession to his possible better judgment helped her husband wonderfully. "We will make it come right," he said, decidedly. "And now I will leave you to rest a little, while I go down and discover whether this house is inhabited to-day." With the door closing after him seemed to go much of Ruth's courage. This exquisite room was a rest to her beauty-loving eyes and heart, but it contrasted most strangely with the life below stairs, and when she thought of that room below, it reminded her of all there was yet to meet and endure, and of the newness of the way, and the untried experiments which were to be made, and of her own weakness, and her heart trembled and almost failed her. Yet it must not fail her. She must get through. Well for Ruth that she knew in what place to seek it. Instead of taking a seat in the delicately carved and gracefully upholstered easy chair, which invited her into its depths, she turned and knelt before it. Perhaps, after all, there are more dangerous experiences than those which, in coming to a new home, to take up new responsibilities, lead us to feel our utter weakness, and bring us to our knees crying to the strong for strength. Judge Burnham's entrance, nearly an hour afterward, found Ruth resting quietly in that easy chair, such a calm on her face, and such a light in her eyes, that he stopped on the threshold, and regarded her with a half-pleased, half-awed expression, as he said: "You look wonderfully rested. I think my easy chair must be a success. Will you come down now to a farmhouse supper? Please don't see any more of the strange things than you can help. I tried to get the girls to come up, and so avoid some of the horrors of a meeting below stairs, but they are too thoroughly alarmed to have any sense at all, and I had to abandon that plan." "Poor things!" said Ruth, compassionately. "Am I so very formidable? It must be dreadful to feel frightened at people. I can't imagine the feeling." He surveyed her critically, then laughed. He had some conception of what a vision she would be to the people downstairs. She had not changed her traveling dress, which was of rich dark silk, fitted exquisitely to her shapely form, and the soft laces at throat and wrist, brightened only by a knot of ribbon of the most delicate tint of blue, completed what, to Judge Burnham's cultured taste, seemed the very perfection of a toilet. "You do not frighten me," he said. "I can manage to look at you without being overwhelmed. I shall not answer for anybody else. Ruth, I have obeyed you to the very letter. In a fit of something very like vexation, I resolved not to lift a finger to change the customs of the house, leaving you to see them, according to your desire, as they were. The result is, we haven't even a table to ourselves to-night. The whole of that insufferable family, cat and all, are ready to gather, with us, around their hospitable board. I am sorry, now, that I was so very literal in my obedience." "I am not." Ruth said, and her tone was quiet, and had a sound in it which was not there when he left her. It served to make him regard her again curiously. Then they went downstairs to the kitchen. Ruth was presently seated at the long table, alarmingly near to the stove which had cooked the potatoes that graced the evening meal. Boiled potatoes, served in their original coats! To be eaten with two tined steel forks, the same forks expected to do duty in the mastication of a huge piece of peach pie! Unless, indeed, she did as her husband's daughters were evidently accustomed to doing, and ate it with her knife. There were, at that table, Farmer Ferris in his shirt-sleeves, himself redolent of the barn and the cow-house; his wife, in a new, stiff, blue and red plaid calico, most manifestly donned to do honor to the occasion; two boys, belonging to the Ferris household, in different degrees of shock-headed, out-at-the-elbow disorder, and the aforesaid apparition in pink calico, the gray cat still hugged to her heart, and eating milk from the same saucer at intervals; and lastly, the two daughters of the house of Burnham. Those daughters! The strongest emotion which Ruth found it in her heart to have for them, on this first evening, was pity. She had never imagined anything like the painful embarrassment which they felt. They sat on the edges of their chairs, and, when engaged in trying to eat, tilted the chairs forward to reach their plates, and rested their elbows on the table to stare, when they dared to raise their frightened eyes to do so. Their father had performed the ceremony of introduction in a way which was likely to increase their painful self-consciousness. "Girls," he said, and his voice sounded as if he were summoning them to a trial by jury, "this is Mrs. Burnham." And they had stood up, and essayed to make little bobbing curtsies, after the fashion of 50 years ago, until further pressed by Mrs. Ferris, who said with a conscious laugh, "For the land's sake, girls, do go and shake hands with her. Why, she is your ma now." But Judge Burnham's haughty voice had come to the rescue. "If you please, we will excuse them from that ceremony, Mrs. Ferris," he had said. "Mrs. Burnham, please be seated." And he had drawn back her chair with the courtesy of a gentleman and the inward fury of a lion. In truth, Judge Burnham was ashamed of and angry with himself, and I am glad of it. He deserved to be. Instead of asserting his authority and making this meeting and this first meal together strictly a family matter, and managing a dozen other little details which he could have managed, and which would have helped wonderfully, he had angrily resolved to let everything utterly alone, and bring Ruth thus sooner and more decisively into seeing the folly, and the utter untenableness of her position. But something in the absolute calm of her face this evening, a calm which had come to her since he left her in their room alone, made him feel it to be more than probable that she would not easily, nor soon, abandon the position which she had assumed. The ordeal of supper was gotten through with easier than Ruth had supposed possible, though truth to tell, the things which would have affected most persons the least, were the hardest for her to bear. She had not entirely risen above the views concerning refinement which she had expressed during the early days of Chautauqua life, and to eat with a knife when a fork should be used, and to have a two-tined steel fork instead of a silver one, and to have no napkin at all, were to her positive and vivid sources of discomfort, sources from which she could not altogether turn away, even at this time. I am not sure, however, that, in the trivialities, she did not lose some of the real trials which the occasion certainly presented. Directly after the supper was concluded, with but a very poor attempt at eating on Ruth's part, Judge Burnham led the way to that dreadful parlor, interposing his stern voice between the evident intention of the daughters to remain in the kitchen, "I desire that you come immediately to the parlor." As for Ruth and himself, they did not retreat promptly enough to escape Mrs. Ferris's stage whisper, "For the land's sake, girls, do go quick. I'm afraid he will bite you next time. I wonder if she is as awful cross as he is. She looks it, and more, too." In the midst of all the tumult of thought which there might have been, Ruth found herself trying to determine which was the most objectionable expression of the two, Mrs. Judge Erskine's favorite, "land alive," or Mrs. Ferris's, "for the land's sake." Where do Americans get their favorite expletives, anyway? She had not much time to query, for here were those girls, sitting each on the edge of one of the solemn cane-seated chairs, and looking as thoroughly miserable as the most hard-hearted could have desired. What was she to say to them, or would it be more merciful to say nothing at all? Ruth felt an unutterable pity for them. How miserably afraid they were of their father! How entirely unnatural it seemed! And it could not be that he had ever been actually unkind to them? It was just a system of severe letting alone, combined with the unwisdom of the Ferris tongue which had developed such results. Between the intervals of trying to say a few words to them, words which they answered with solemn "yes, ma'ams," Ruth tried to study their personal appearance. It was far from prepossessing. Yet, remembering Susan, and the marvelous changes which the ivy-green dress, fitted to her form, had accomplished, wondered how much of their painful awkwardness was due to the utter unsuitability of their attire, and the uncouth arrangement of their coiffures. The elder of the two was tall and gaunt, with pale, reddish-yellow hair, an abundance of it, which she seemed to think served no purpose but to annoy her, and was to be stretched back out of the way as far and as tightly as possible. Her shoulders were bent and stooping. Her pale blue eyes looked as though, when they were not full of dismayed embarrassment, they were listless, and her whole manner betokened that of a person who was a trial to herself and to every one with whom she came in contact. People, with such forms and faces, almost invariably manage to fit themselves out in clothing which shows every imperfection to advantage. This girl was no exception. Indeed, she seemed to have succeeded in making an exceptional fright of herself. Her dress was of the color and material which seemed to increase her height, and bore the marks of a novice in dressmaking about every part of it. To increase the effect, it was much too short for her, and showed to immense disadvantage a pair of strong, thick country boots, which might have been excellent for tramping over plowed ground in wet weather. The younger sister was a complete contrast in every respect. Her form can only be described by that expressive and not very elegant word, chunky. From her thick, short hair, down to her thickly shod feet, she seemed to be almost equally shapeless and graceless. Fat, red cheeks, small, round eyes shining out from layers of fat, large, ill-shaped hands, remarkably large feet, apparently, or else her shoes were, and arrayed in a large plaited dress of red and green, which was much too low in the neck and much too short-waisted, and was absolutely uncouth. Swiftly, silently, Ruth took in all these details. And she took in, also, what her husband had never known, that a large portion of this uncouthness was due to the outward adornings or disguisings, which is what persons devoid of taste sometimes succeed in making of their dress. In the midst of her musings there came to her a new idea. It dawned upon her in the form of a question. Why should she, a lady of fashion and of leisure, and of such cultured taste that she was an acknowledged authority among her friends on all matters pertaining to the aesthetic, be in so marked a manner, for the second time in her short life, brought face to face with that form of ill-breeding which troubled her the most? Not only face to face with it, but put in such a position that it was her duty to endorse it patiently and show kindly interest in the victims. Was it possible? And this thought flashed upon her like a revelation, that she had been wont to make too much of this matter, that she had allowed the lack of culture in these directions to press her too sorely. Now, do you know that this was the first time such a possibility had dawned on Ruth Burnham? So insensible had been her yielding to the temptation which wealth and leisure brings, to give too much thought and too high a place to these questions of dress and taste, that, as I say, she had not been conscious of any sin in that direction, while those who looked on at her life had been able to see it plainly and in exaggerated form. I suspect, dear friend, that you, at this moment, are the victim of some inconsistency which your next-door neighbor sees plainly, and which, possibly, injures your influence over her, and you are not conscious of its development. Now, that is a solemn thought, as well as a perplexing one, for what is to be done about it? Cleanse thou me from secret faults, prayed the inspired writer. May he not have meant those faults so secret that it takes the voice of God to reveal them to our hearts? At least to Ruth Burnham, sitting there in that high-backed rocker, looking at her husband's daughters, the thought came like the voice of God's Spirit in her heart. She had come very near to that revealing Spirit during the last 2 hours. Rather, he had made his presence known to her. She was in a hushed mood, desiring to be led, and she plainly saw that even this exhibition of uncouthness could be a discipline to her soul, if she would but allow its voice. You are not to understand that she therefore concluded uncouthness and utter disregard of refined tastes to be necessary outgrowths of Christian experience, or to be in the least necessary to a higher development of Christian life. She merely had a glimpse of what it meant to be in a state of using this world as not abusing it. The thought quickened her resolutions in regard to these neglected girls thus thrown under her care, and, I have no doubt, that it toned her voice when she spoke to them. I believe it not irreverent to say that the very subject upon which she first addressed them was chosen for her, all unconsciously to herself, by that ever-present Spirit, to whom nothing that an immortal soul can say appears trivial, because he sees the waves of influence which are stirred years ahead by the quiet words. Just what the 2 frightened girls expected from her would have been, perhaps, difficult for even themselves to explain. For years all their intercourse with their father had consisted in a series of irritated lectures, delivered in a sharp key, on his part, and received in a frightened silence by them. He had been utterly disappointed with them in every respect, and had not failed to show it, and they had not failed to seek for sympathy by pouring the story of their grievances into Mrs. Ferris's willing ears. The result was that she had but increased their terror in and doubt of their father. Added to this, she had all the ignorant superstition of her class in regard to stepmothers, if indeed the views of this sort of people shall be called by no harsher name than superstition. The newcomer had been, during the last week, most freely discussed in the Ferris household, and the result had been what might have been expected. Therefore, it was with unfeigned amazement and with the demonstrations of prolonged stares, that Ruth's first suddenly spoken sentence broke the silence which the others were feeling keenly. "Your hair looks as though it would curl naturally. Did you ever try it?" This to the elder girl, whose whole face reddened under the astonishment produced by the query, and who, as I said, could only stare for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am, I did once, long time ago." "And didn't you like the appearance?" A more vivid blush and a conscious laugh was the answer. Then she added, "Why, yes, well enough, but it was such a bother, and nobody to care." "Oh, it is very little trouble," Mrs. Burnham answered lightly, "when you understand just how to manage it. I think natural curls are beautiful." End of chapter 19. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 20 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 20. A Sister Needed. Some vigorous planning was done that night which followed Ruth Burnham's introduction to her new home. It was not restless planning, neither could it be said to be about new things, for these things Ruth had studied every day since the first week of her engagement, and the summer, which was in its springtime then, was fading now, so she had thought before. But something had given her thoughts new strength and force. Ruth believed it to be that hour which she had spent alone on her knees. She had spent many an hour before that alone on her knees, but never had the power of the unseen presence taken such hold upon her as at that time. She had felt her own powerlessness as Ruth Erskine had not been given to feeling it, and you know it is man's extremity that is God's opportunity. It was before the hour of breakfast that she commenced the process of developing some of her plans to her husband. "How long will it take to dispose of the Ferris family?" she asked him, and her voice was so calm, so full of strength, and conscious determination that it rested him. "It can be done just as soon as your genius, combined with my executive ability, can bring it to pass," he said, laughing, "and I sincerely hope and trust that you will be brilliant and rapid in your display of genius." "But, Judge Burnham, ought they to have warning, as we do with servants?" "A week's warning? I trust not. I should not promise to endure a week of it. Oh, they are prepared. I broadly hinted to them that the mistress would want the house to herself. If they had not felt the necessity of being here to welcome you, it could have been managed before this. They have their plans formed, I believe, and as soon as you want to manage without them, I will make it for their interest to be in haste." Ruth turned toward him with a relieved smile and an eager air. "Could you manage, then, to make it to their interest to go before breakfast, or shall we have to wait until that meal is over?" He laughed gayly. "Your energy is refreshing," he said, "especially when it is bestowed in such a worthy cause. No, I think we will have to wait until after breakfast. But, Ruth, are you really in earnest? Do you actually mean to settle down here, in this house, as it is? And what are you going to do about help and about, well, everything?" Before she answered, she came over and stood beside him, slipping her hand through his arm and speaking in tender earnestness. "Judge Burnham, I want you to understand me. I feel that I may have seemed hard, and cold, and selfish. Perhaps I have been selfish in pushing my plan. I think I have been, but I did not intend it for selfishness. I was, and am, led by what seems to be our duty, yours and mine. Those girls of yours have been neglected. I can see how you, being a man, would not know what to do. At the same time, I can see how I, being a woman, can at least try to do many things, and I am very eager to try. You may call it an experiment if you will, and if it is, in your estimation, in 6 months from now an utter failure, I will give it up and do exactly as you propose." There was a gleam of assurance in her eyes, and he could see that she did not believe he would ever be called upon to follow his plans. But something tender and pleading in her tone touched him, and he said with feeling, "I begin to realize forcibly what has only come upon me in touches heretofore, that I have not done my duty by the girls. I did not know what to do. I used to study the question and try to plan it, but I can not tell you how utterly hopeless it seemed to me. Finally, I gave it up. I determined that nothing could ever be done but to support them and live away from them, and long before I knew you I determined on that as my line of action. So your resolution was a surprise to me, an overwhelming one. But perhaps you are right. At least I will try to help you in whatever way I can to carry out your plans, however wild they are, and I begin to realize that you may possibly have some very wild ones, but I promise allegiance." "Good," said Ruth, with sparkling eyes. "I ask nothing better than that. Then we will proceed at once to business. There is so much to be done that I don't feel like taking a wedding journey just now. We can enjoy it so much more when we get our house in order. There are certain things that I need to know at once. First, how much or how little is there to be done to this house, and to everything? In other words, how much money am I to spend?" "Oh," he said, looking relieved, "I thought you were going to ask me what ought to be done to make the place habitable, and really, I hardly know where to commence. I shall be charmed to leave it in your hands. As to money, I think I may safely promise you what you need, unless your ideas are on a more magnificent scale than I think. I will give you my check this morning for $1,000, and when that is used you may come to me for as much more. Is that an answer to your question?" "An entirely satisfactory one," she answered him with shining eyes, and they went down to breakfast with a sense of satisfaction which, considering the surroundings and the marvelous calicoes in which the daughters of the house appeared, was surprising. "I don't see the way clear to results," Judge Burnham said, perplexedly, as he and his wife walked on the piazza after breakfast and continued the discussion of ways and means. "If the Ferris tribe vacate to-day, as I have just intimated to the head of the family is extremely desirable, what are you to do for help until such time as something competent in that line can be secured, always supposing that there is such a thing in existence? I remember what an experience you have been having in your father's house in the line of help." "Oh, well," said Ruth, brightly, "we had the smallpox, you know; that makes a difference. They have excellent servants there now, and, indeed, we generally have had. My housekeeping troubles did not lie in that direction. I have a plan. I don't know what you will think of it. I am afraid you will be very much surprised." "No, I shall not," he interrupted her to say. "I have gotten beyond the condition of surprise at anything which you may do or propose." Then she went on with her story. "I thought it all over last night, and if she will do it, I think I see my way clear, and I am almost sure she will, for, really, I never knew a more unselfish girl in my life." "I dare say," her husband said, regarding her with an amused air. "Perhaps I might agree with you if you will enlighten me as to which of the patterns of domestic unselfishness you have in mind. Did she reign in your household since my knowledge of it began?" "Oh, I am not speaking of hired help," Ruth said, and a vivid flush brightened her cheeks. "I was thinking of my sister. It is her help I have in mind." "Susan!" he exclaimed, and then was suddenly silent. His face showed that, after all, she had surprised him. There was much talk about it after that, and their discussion finally ended in their taking passage in the mail wagon, about which Judge Burnham had spoken the day before, and jogging together to the train. There was so much to be done that Ruth had not the patience to wait until another day, besides their departure would give the Ferris family a chance to hasten their movements. On the way to the cars Judge Burnham mentally resolved that his first leisure moments should be spent in selecting horses and a driver, since he was to become a country gentleman. Whether he would or not, it became him to look out for conveniences. Seated again in the train, and made comfortable by her watchful husband, Ruth took time to smile over the variety of experiences through which she had gone during the less than 24 hours since she sat there before. It seemed to her that she had lived a little lifetime, and learned a great deal, and it seemed a wonderful thing that she was actually going to Susan Erskine with a petition for help. Who could have supposed that she, Ruth Erskine, would ever have reached such a period in her history that she would turn to her as the only available source of supply and comfort? A great deal of thinking can be done in one night, and Ruth had lain awake and gone over her ground with steady gaze and a determined heart. It surprised her that things had not looked plainer to her before. "Why couldn't I have seen this way yesterday before I left home?" she asked herself, but the wonder was that she had seen it thus early. Very much surprised were the Erskine household to see their bride of less than 24 hours standing appear while they still lingered over their breakfast table. "We live in the country, you know," was Ruth's composed explanation of the early advent. "Country people are up hours before town people have stirred. I always knew that." "Land alive!" said Mrs. Judge Erskine, and then for a whole minute she was silent. She confided to Ruth long afterward that for about 5 minutes her "heart was in her mouth," for she surely thought they had quarreled and parted. "Though I thought at the time," she explained, "that if you had got sick of it already you wouldn't have come back together and have walked into the dining room in that friendly fashion. But then I remembered that you never did things like anybody else in this world, and if you had made up your mind to come back home again and leave your husband, you would be sure to pick out a way of doing it, that no other mortal would ever have thought of. "I am going to my room," Ruth said presently. "Judge Burnham, I will hasten and be ready to go downtown with you in a very little while. Susan, will you come with me, please? I want to talk to you." And Susan rose with alacrity, a pleasant smile lighting her plain face. There was a sound of sisterliness in the tone, which she had watched and waited for, but rarely heard. "I have come on the strangest errand," Ruth said, dropping into her own favorite chair, as the door of her old room closed after them. "I feel as if I were at least a year older than I was yesterday. I have thought so much. First of all, Susan, I want to tell you something. I have found something. I have come close to Jesus. I mean, he has come close to me. He has almost shown me himself. I don't know how to tell you about it, and indeed I am not sure that there is anything to tell. But it is a great deal to have experienced. I seem to have heard him say, 'Come to me. Why do you struggle, and plan, and toss yourself about? Haven't I promised you rest?' And Susan, I do believe he spoke to my heart. Why not?" "Why not, indeed?" said Susan, "when he has repeated the message so many times. Ruth, I am so glad." Then Ruth ran rapidly from that subject to less important ones, giving her sister a picture, in brief, of the new home, closing with the sentence, "Now I am in a dilemma. I can't keep any of the Ferris family for an hour, and I can't introduce new servants until things are in different shape, and I can't get them into different shape until I have help. Do you see what I am to do?" "Yes," said Susan, with a bright smile. "You need a sister, one who knows how to help in all household matters, and yet who knows how to keep her tongue reasonably quiet as to what she found. I know how servants gossip, some of them. That Rosie we had for a week tried to tell me things about Mrs. Dr. Blakeman's kitchen that would make her feel like fainting if she knew it. A sister is just exactly what you need in this emergency. Will you let her step into the gap and show you how nicely she can fill it?" "Will you?" Ruth asked, eagerly. "That is just exactly what I wanted to say, though I didn't like to say it, for fear you would misunderstand, not realize, you know, that it is because we don't want to go out of the family for assistance just now that we needed you so much." Recognized at last in words as a member of the family! An unpremeditated sentence, evidently from the heart. It was what Susan Erskine had been patiently biding her time and waiting for. It had come sooner than she expected. It made her cheeks glow. "I will go home with you at once," she said, in a businesslike way. "There is nothing to hinder. The machinery of this house is in running order again. That new second girl is a treasure, Ruth, and, by the way, she has a sister who might develop into a treasure for you. Now let me see if I understand things. What do you want me to do first?" "First," said Ruth, smiling, "I need you to go shopping. It is my forte, you know. I like to buy things, and at last there is certainly occasion for my buying. Susan, you have no idea how much is wanted. Everything in every line is necessary, and Judge Burnham has left all to me. We need paper hangers and painters and all that sort of thing, but of course he will attend to those things. Our plan is to return to night with a load of necessities. Judge Burnham is going to hire a team at once, and have it loaded. But what are the first necessities? Where shall I begin?" "Begin with a pencil and paper," said Susan, seizing upon them and seating herself. "Now, let us be methodical. My teacher in mathematics once told me that I was nothing if I was not methodical. Kitchen first. No, dining room, because we shall have to eat even before we get the house in order. What is a necessity to that table before you can have a comfortable meal?" Then they plunged into business. Two women, thoroughly in earnest, pencil and paper in hand, bank check in pocket, organization well developed in both of them, and the need of speed apparent, can accomplish surprising things in the way of plans in an hour of time, especially when one is persistently methodical. When Mrs. Burnham arose and drew her wrap around her preparatory to joining the husband, who was waiting below, she felt as though a week's work had been accomplished. Besides, they had been cheery together, these two; been in a different mood toward each other from what had ever appeared before. Susan was so sensible, so quick-witted, so clear-sighted as to what needed doing first, and as to ways of doing the soonest, and withal her matter-of-course way of saying we when she spoke of the work to arrange, made her appear such a tower of strength to Ruth, who knew so well her own delinquencies in the direction of housework, and who had thoroughly tested Susan's practical knowledge. "Land alive!" ejaculated Mrs. Erskine, when, after Ruth's departure, the new arrangements were presented to her for approval. "Who would have thought she would have to come after you, in less than a day after she set out to do for herself? So capable as she is, too, though I don't suppose she knows much more than a kitten about housework. How should she? Well, I'm glad I had you learn all them things. What we'd have done this winter if I hadn't is more than I can see through. Well, well, child, I don't know how we are going to get along without you. Your pa sets great store by you. I can see it every day. And what if I should have another turn of sick headache while you're gone? Though, for that matter, I don't believe I will. I guess going through the smallpox cured them headaches. I ain't had one since. And so she needs you right off? Well, poor thing. I don't know what she would do without you, I'm sure. Them girls ain't efficient, I dare say. Girls never are. You'll learn 'em how, Susan. You can do it, if anybody can, and that'll be doing 'em a good turn." Susan discreetly kept her own counsel about "them girls," and quietly and swiftly packed her satchel, not without an exultant song at her heart. This beautiful sister, whose love she had craved, seemed very near to her this morning. End of chapter 20. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 21 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 21. Trying Questions. You are to imagine much that was done inside that long, low house on the hill during the next 3 weeks. A great deal can be done in 3 weeks' time. What was actually accomplished would fill a good-sized volume. So it is well that you are to imagine instead of read about it. A great many wheels of progress were started during that very first day, Ruth among the stores, Judge Burnham among the paper hangers, painters, and draymen, Susan in the Erskine attic, sorting out and packing many things that, according to Judge Erskine's orders, were Ruth's exclusive property. By the time the 5 o'clock train received the three, they were tired and satisfied. Tired though they were, it was as late as midnight before all the household settled into rest. Susan dropped into her place as naturally as though it had been waiting for her all these years. The Ferris family were departed, bag and baggage, and the 2 Burnhams left behind were red-eyed and disconsolate. Why not? The Ferrises were the only friends they had ever known. Susan put a sympathetic arm around one and kissed the other before she had been in the house 5 minutes, and Ruth remembered with dismay that she had not thought of doing such a thing. And, indeed, if I must tell you the truth concerning her, it seemed almost an impossible thing to do. She had been for so many years in the habit of bestowing her kisses rarely, and to such an exceedingly limited number of persons. Then they betook themselves, Susan and Seraphina, to the kitchen. Confusion reigned. So it did all over the house, except in the locked-up purity of Ruth's 2 rooms. But before midnight there was a comfortable place for Susan to sleep, and most satisfactory preparations in line for a breakfast the next morning. It was that next morning which gave the 2 Burnham girls their first touch of a cultured home. There was a little room, conveniently situated as regarded the kitchen, which the instinct of taste had made Ruth select at the first glance as a dining room. Thither she and Susan repaired early in the evening to make a survey. "It needs painting," said Susan, scanning the woodwork critically. And papering. And then, with a pretty carpet, it will be just the thing. But in the meantime it is clean, and we can set the breakfast table here to-morrow morning, can't we?" "If we can get it in here to set," Ruth answered in a dubious tone. "It is a long, horribly shaped table, and none of our furniture will be here, you know." "Oh, I see my way out of that. There is a little table in that pantry, or milk room, or whatever is the name of it, that will do nicely for a dining table until we get settled. And, Ruth, shall we have some of my muffins for breakfast? You remember Judge Burnham used to like them when we gave them to him occasionally for tea. Oh, girls, I can make delicious muffins, and if you are both down here by 6 o'clock to-morrow morning, I will teach you how the first thing I do." This last to the two bewildered girls, who stood waiting to see what astonishing thing would happen next. As for Ruth, she went upstairs to that gem of a room, smiling over the strangeness of the thought that Susan was downstairs in their kitchen, hers and Judge Burnham's, planning with his daughters to have muffins for breakfast. Also she thought, with a sense of satisfaction, of the great trunk packed with silver, rare old pieces of her mother's own, which had been held sacred for her during all these years, and of the smaller and newer trunk containing table drapery, which was a marvel of fineness and whiteness. Both trunks had journeyed hither several days ago, and had this night been opened to secure certain things which Susan's morning plans had called for. So it was to the little room that the family came the next morning, with its south window, into which the September sun slanted its rays cheerily. The room itself was carpetless, and the chairs were wooden, and there was no other attempt at furniture. But the table, laid in snowy whiteness, and the napkins large and fine and of delicate pattern, and the silver service gleaming before Ruth's place, and the silver forks and solid silver spoons, and the glittering goblets and delicate china, for Susan had actually unpacked and washed and arranged Ruth's mother's china, to say nothing of the aroma of coffee floating in the air, and mingling not unpleasantly with the whiff of a vase of autumn roses which blushed before Ruth's plate. All these things were a lesson in home refinements such as a week of talking would never have accomplished, and which the Burnham girls sat down to for the first time in their lives. It was curious to notice the effect on them. Their conspicuous calicoes and stretched back hair and ungainly shoes were still painfully visible. But for the first time, apparently, it dawned upon them that things didn't match. They surveyed the table, which was as a picture to them, and then, with instinctive movements, essayed to hide their awkward shoes under their too short dresses, and blushed painfully over the impossibility of doing so. Ruth noticed it, and smiled. They would be ready for her hand, she fancied, when she came to an hour of leisure to arrange for them. That breakfast scene was a cheery one. So much of home had already entered into its elements that Judge Burnham cordially pronounced Susan a fairy, and she as genially responded that she was a most substantial one, and had had 2 substantial helpers, with a meaning glance toward the girls. "Indeed," he said, in a kindly tone, and then he glanced toward them. That was a very pleasant way of showing goodwill. The contrast between this breakfast and the one to which they sat down but one morning before was certainly very striking; and, though the girls blushed painfully, the tone in which he had spoken, and the glance which accompanied his remark, did more for those girls than all their father's lectures had accomplished. Directly the muffins and the broiled steak and the amber coffee were discussed, and, the meal concluded, business in that house commenced. Thereafter it was a scene of organized disorder. The girls, under Susan's lead, proved, notwithstanding Mrs. Judge Erskine's surmise, very efficient helpers. They could not enter a room properly, they could not use the King's English very well, and they knew nothing about the multitude of little accomplishments with which the girls of their age usually consume time. But it transpired that they could wash windows, and paints, and sweep walls, and even nail carpets. They were both quick-witted and skillful over many of these employments, and the hearty laugh which occasionally rung out from their vicinity when Susan was with them, showed plainly that they had lost their fear of her. But their embarrassment, where either their father or Ruth was concerned, did not decrease; and instead, in the whirl of plans which had recently come upon them, these two had little leisure to cultivate the daughter's acquaintance. Ruth, after a few attempts at helping, discreetly left the ordering of the hired helpers to Susan's skillful hands, and accompanied her husband on daily shopping excursions, where her good taste and good sense were equally called into action. In the course of time, and when there is a full purse to command skillful helpers, the time need not be so very long drawn out. There came a morning when it would have done your comfort-loving heart good to have walked with Judge Burnham and his wife through the reconstructed house. Nothing showy, nothing really expensive, as that term is used in the fashionable world, had been attempted. Ruth's tastes were too well cultured for that. She knew, perfectly, that what was quite in keeping with the lofty ceilings and massive windows of her father's house would be ridiculously out of place here. As you passed with her from room to room, you would have realized that nothing looked out of place. Perhaps in the girls' room as much thought had been expended as in any place in that house. Ruth had been amazed, not to say horrified, on the occasion of her first visit to their room, to find that it was carpetless, curtainless, and, I had almost said, furnitureless. An old-fashioned, high-post bedstead, destitute of any pretense of beauty, and a plain painted stand, holding a tin basin and a broken-nosed milk pitcher. To Ruth, whose one experience of life had to do with her father's carefully furnished house, where the servants' rooms were well supplied with the comforts, to say nothing of the luxuries of the toilet, this looked simply barbarous. Judge Burnham, too, was shocked and subdued. It had been years since he had been a caller in his daughter's room, and he had seemed to think that magic of some sort must have supplied their wants. "I furnished money whenever it was asked for," he said, regarding Ruth with a sort of appealing air. "Now that I think of it, they were never extravagant in their demands, but I supposed I gave them enough. At least, when I thought about it at all, I assured myself that the Ferrises would certainly not be afraid to ask for more, if more was needed." "The difficulty with the Ferris family was, that they had no tastes to expend money for," Ruth said, quietly, "but you cannot wonder that the girls were not just what we would like to see them. They certainly have had no surroundings of any sort that would educate them in your direction." After this talk he entered with heartiness into the plans for that room, and when the delicate blue and pale gold carpet was laid, and it reminded one of a sunset in a pure sky, and the white drapery was looped with blue ribbons, rural fashion, and the gold-banded china was gracefully disposed on the toilet case, and the dressing bureau was adorned with all the little daintinesses which Ruth understood so well how to scatter, even to a blue and gold vase full of sweet-scented blossoms, and the pretty cottage bedstead was luxuriously draped in spotless white, plump pillows, ruffled pillow-shams, all complete, Ruth stood back and surveyed the entire effect with the most intense satisfaction. What said the girls? Well, they said nothing, but their blazing cheeks and suspiciously wet eyes looked volumes, and for several days they stepped about that room in a tiptoe fashion which would have amused Ruth had she seen it. They did not rally from the feeling that everything about them was so delicate and pure that to breathe upon or touch would be to mar a work of art. Meantime, other matters had been progressing. Ruth had lain awake half of one night and studied the immortal question of dress. She had met and battled with, and conquered half a dozen forms of pride, and then had boldly announced at the next morning's breakfast table the following: "Judge Burnham, the girls and I want to go to the city to attend to some dressmaking. Shall we go in that mail wagon, or how?" Before this, I should have explained to you that Judge Burnham had been, for some days, in an active state of trying horses, examining carriages, and interviewing professional drivers. Also, several horses and carriages had waited on them for trial, so that Ruth had taken several rides to the cars on trial, and had at once suggested that perhaps it would be as economical a way of keeping a carriage as any this spending the season in making a choice. Therefore Judge Burnham laughed as he answered: "Why, no, there is to be a trial span here in time for the 10 o'clock train. I was about to propose a ride in honor of that occasion. Are you going into town for the day?" Ruth laughed. "For the week, I am afraid. We shall probably be detained at the dressmaker's for some time, and, after that, I have many errands to do." Now the form in which her pride had met her last was the shrinking from going to town, and above all, going to the fashionable dressmaking and millinery establishments with those strange-looking companions, for a critical survey of their wardrobe revealed the fact that they had nothing which she considered decent. It was not the first time that she had taken the subject into consideration. On the contrary, it had been present with her during her shopping excursions, and she had blessed the instinct which enabled her to see at a glance just what shade or tint would suit the opposite complexions of the two girls. She had visited her dressmaker and made arrangements with her for service. But the question had been, whether she could not smuggle them off in some way to a quieter street among the less fashionable workers, and secure for them a respectable outfit in which to appear at Madame Delfort's. It was over these and kindred plans that she had lain awake, and finally abandoned them all, and resolved upon outright unconcern in regard to what others might say or think. Nevertheless, she winced when the two girls came down arrayed in their best, bright plaids, for Mrs. Ferris's taste had run entirely in that direction, cheap hat adorned with cheap flowers and brilliant ribbons, both flowers and ribbons more or less soiled, and with no gloves at all. Seraphina reported that she had lost hers, and Araminta that she couldn't find hers. Between these two states there is a distinction, though it may not appear at first sight. The trial carriage had arrived, and Judge Burnham seated his party, himself wearing a disturbed face. He did not like the appearance of the company with which he was to go to town. Ruth had thought of this, and had tried to plan differently, but with a man's obtuseness he had not thought of it, and could not or would not understand why he should go in on the 10 o'clock train, and the rest wait till 12, especially when his wife admitted herself to be in haste, and they might all go together. Fairly seated opposite his daughters, he saw a reason for having gone earlier, and even looked about him nervously as the carriage neared the depot, wishing there was yet some chance of escape. A way opened. "Ah, good morning, Judge. This is fortunate. I am in search of you." This was the greeting which he received from the depot door. And he left Ruth standing on the steps and went forward to shake hands with a tall, gray-haired man in the prime of life. He came back after a few moments, speaking rapidly. "Ruth, that is Parsons, the famous criminal lawyer. He wants to consult me in regard to a case, and is going farther on by the next train in search of a clue. I guess, after all, I shall have to wait here for the 12 o'clock, and have a talk with him; that is, if you do not object." "Oh, not at all," Ruth said, breathing more freely. Her husband's daughters were less of a cross to her without him than with him. Every man he met on the train knew and came to talk with him, while she was a stranger. The famous criminal lawyer moved toward them, looking interested, and Judge Burnham could hardly escape the ceremony of introduction. "Ah," he said, bowing low to Mrs. Burnham, "very happy to meet you, madame? I have known your husband for several years. I hear you are just getting settled at your country seat. Terrible task, isn't it? But pays, I suppose, when one gets fairly settled. I didn't know until the other day that you were rural in your tastes, Judge Burnham." All these sentences, spoken in the man-of-the-world tone which indicates that the person is talking for the sake of filling the time, and all the while his practiced eye was taking in the group. Judge Burnham with a slightly embarrassed manner and somewhat flushed face, his elegant, high-bred wife, who was a trifle pale as she was wont to be under strong feeling of any sort, and the two girls, in outer attire, standing a little apart, with wide eyes and flaming cheeks, staring painfully. The criminal lawyer seemed to think that the position demanded more words from him. "You are the victims of the usual American nuisance, I see. with the slightest possible inclination of his head toward the two. "The inefficiency of hired help is really the social puzzle of this country, I think. Foreigners have immensely the advantage of us. Just returning a relay of the condemned sort, I suppose?" There was the rising inflection to his sentence which marks a question, and yet he rattled on, precisely like a man who expects no answer. Was it because the train sounded its warning whistle just then that Judge Burnham, though his face flushed and his eyes flashed, did not correct the criminal lawyer's mistake? End of chapter 21. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 22 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 22. That which satisfieth not. Fairly seated in the train, Ruth Burnham gave herself up to gloominess over her own planning. The episode with the famous criminal lawyer not having served to sweeten her way, she speedily determined on making as little across of the rest of it as she could, too fully realizing that, plan as she would, the way was across. She still shrank from the fashionable madames, and her fashionable corps of workers. Perhaps the worriment was what she deserved for being so fashionable in her desires that she could not bring herself to look up an obscure back street with a modest sign, and thus help along the large army of workers who cannot be fashionable, though really there are two sides to even that question. She understood that as a rule the work done from that back street would be a continual source of mortification to her, a constant strain on her temper, so long as the garments lasted. After all, it is not so much the desire to be in the height of the fashion that sends women to the extravagantly high-priced modistes as a knowledge of the fact that as a rule the low-priced ones do not understand their business and will succeed in making a bungle of any work which they undertake. When there shall arise a class of women who have carefully learned how to cut and make ordinary garments in the best manner, the cry of hard times, among such workers, will be less frequently heard. Ruth concluded not to risk contact with chance acquaintances in street cars, but directly she reached the city, took a carriage to a store where she was a stranger, and did some rapid transforming work. 2 stylish wraps, selected with due deference to their qualifications for covering much objectionable toilet underneath, selected, too, with careful reference to the height and shape and complexion of the wearers; then gloves that were strong and neat-fitting and shapely; then hats of easily donned stamp, gracefully yet slightly trimmed, and really, Judge Burnham would hardly have recognized his daughters. Ruth surveyed them with satisfaction, and, if they could have been fitted at the madame's without removing these stylish mantles, she would have drawn a sigh of relief. As it was, she still had that to dread, and a real ordeal it was. Those who condemn her for exhibiting much false pride and foolish lack of independence have probably never been tried in the same way. You have, of course, observed that people's own peculiar trials are the ones for which they have sympathy. They are harder, too, to bear than any other person's. Ruth was not one whit behind the multitude in her way of thinking about herself. As she stood in the madame's apartments and endured the well-bred stares and the well-bred impudence, for there really is such a thing as what might be called well-bred impudence, she set her teeth hard, and ruled that the color should not rush into her face, and also that the madame should have no more of her custom from this time forth. And yet, when she came to cooler moments, she tried to reason within herself as to how the woman was to blame. What had she said or looked that was not, under the circumstances, most natural? All these questions Ruth held, for the time being, at bay, and arranged and directed and criticized with her usual calm superiority of manner, and with the assurance of one who knew exactly what she wanted, and intended not to stop short of entire satisfaction. And she didn't. She was more critical and troublesome even than usual. And the madame would have told you that that was unnecessary. And, at last, after many delays and changes of plan and trimmings and changes of patterns, involving vexatious delays on Madame's part, they were free of her for the day, and could pursue their round of shopping more at leisure. But Ruth was in no mood for shopping, other than the necessary things that must be ordered to the Madames without delay. She was tired and fretted. She wanted something to cool and quiet her. She dispatched the necessary shopping with great care, indeed, but with unusual speed, leaving the girls, meantime, seated in the carriage, instead of in the great store, where they would have delighted to be. The business of lunching had been dispatched some time before, as soon, indeed, as they had left the dressmaking establishment. Ruth had chosen an obscure place for refreshment, not choosing to risk the danger of fashionable acquaintances, at the places with which she was familiar. Consequently, she had been able to do little else than gather her skirts about her to protect them from careless and hurried waiters, and to curl her aristocratic nose behind her handkerchief at the unwanted smells combining around her; while the girls, famished by the drain on their nerves, and having, by reason of the excitement of the morning, been unable to indulge in much breakfast, made a hearty meal, not at all disturbed by the sights and sounds and odors which made eating an impossibility to Ruth. This little matter served to add to her discomfort and her sense of gloom; for, when people are hungry, they are much more ready to yield to gloom. All the shopping done that she could bring herself to give attention to, she consulted her watch and learned with dismay that there was an hour and a half before train time. What was to be done with it? She thought of her husband's office. But suppose the criminal lawyer should be there? In any case, there would be those dreadful students to stare, and nudge each other, and giggle. Ruth dreaded a giggle more than she did a bullet. Assuredly, she would not go there. Neither was her city home to be thought of. She was not in a mood to present her husband's daughters to Mrs. Judge Erskine. Neither did she intend that those daughters, in their present attire, or with their present attainments, should come in contact with her. So, as the gloomy-faced woman rode listlessly along, on an uptown car, while the two girls were bobbing their heads swiftly from one window to another, endeavoring to take in all the strange sights, she was engaged in trying to decide what to do with time. A blackboard bulletin before one of the public halls caught her notice, and her quick eye took in the large lettering: Bible reading, Harry Morehouse, here at 4 o'clock. Come. Before she had reached the inviting word, she had signaled the car, and the bewildered girls were following her whither she would. "There is an hour or more before we can go home," she said in explanation. "Let us go to this meeting. Perhaps it will be interesting." They were entirely willing. In fact, they were in a state of maze. Anything that this remarkable woman, who knew her way so composedly through this great whirling city, suggested, they were willing to help carry out. So they mounted the steps to the large, light, social-looking room, where people were already thronging in. No acquaintances to be feared here. Ruth did not know many who frequented such meetings, or were to be found in this part of the city. In the distance she caught a glimpse of Marion, but she shrank back, unwilling to be recognized even by her, for Marion had her beautiful daughter beside her, and the contrast would be too strikingly painful. Presently the meeting opened. Ruth looked about her for Harry Morehouse, a name with which she was not unfamiliar. But she almost curled her lip in disappointment, she was so amazed at the insignificance of this little boyish man. As if he could help anybody, her heart said, in scorn. What exaggerated reports do get into the papers about people! And then, presently, she did just what many other person has done, who has listened to Harry Morehouse's rendering of Scripture; forgot to think of the man, and gave earnest heed to the words which he was reading, words which, some way, had a sound, strangely familiar though they were, as if she had never heard them before. "Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." What was there in the familiar verse that thrilled so with Ruth Burnham's soul? that which satisfieth not. She needed only her own experience to show her that one who understood the human heart spoke these words. How freely she had been giving labor, and how strangely unsatisfying it all seemed to her today. She fairly hungered and thirsted after a higher grasp of the infinite arm reached down. A great longing came over her to hide herself away in Him. She was so tired and so tried, and a long line of petty trials stared her in the face. She felt like turning away from them all, and yet she mustn't. Well then, she felt like reaching higher ground, getting up where the air was purer, where these endless details of dress and position would trouble her less, where such women as Madame, the dressmaker, would have no power to flush her cheek and set her heart to angry beatings by a high-bred stare. Suddenly a new thought flashed across her heart. These girls! What had she been doing for them? How had she been trying to satisfy them? In the days that they had spent together, she remembered that she had not once alluded, even in the most remote manner, to anything higher or better or more satisfying than these new things, which, at best, were to perish with the using. Had she not, by her example, left the impress of her first influence upon them to the effect that well-furnished rooms and carefully adorned bodies were the important things on which to spend one's strength? "Well," she said within her disturbed self, "I have no time." "No time?" inquired that other inner self, which is forever at war with its fellow. "Is it because you have been employed on more important matters?" This almost angered Ruth. It flushed her face, and she said, "There is a proper time for all things." "Yes," said the other one, "and is the proper time to attend to this most important concern with which we have to do in life, after all the lesser matters are disposed of?" Then Ruth roused, and gave her heart some searching into. Was it possible that she had really been teaching those girls that she considered the matter of their outward adorning more important than anything else connected with them? If actions speak even louder than words, and if she had acted the one and not so much as spoken about the other, what else could they think? "I am glad," she told herself, "that I brought them into this meeting. At least they will get a different idea here." Then she turned and looked at them. Would they get different ideas, or had the first taken root, leaving at least no present room for other growths? Miss Seraphina was spreading her hand carefully out in her lap, and contemplating with eyes of unmistakable admiration the color and texture and fit of her new gloves. It was altogether probable that she had never worn well-fitting gloves before, and she felt their importance. The other sister was evidently as totally absorbed in the trimness of her neatly fitting kid boot, the advent of which had made her foot a stranger to herself, with which she was trying to get acquainted, as though Harry Morehouse and his wonderful new Bible had been in London at that moment. A strange pang thrilled the heart of the woman who was trying in her youth to be a mother to these two, as she looked at their absorbed faces and followed the direction of their eyes. Was that simply the necessary result of new refinements? Would these all sink into their proper and subordinate places directly the newness and strangeness had worn off, or was this really a wave of her own influence which was going to increase in power as surely as it was fed? Now, this thought did not rest her, and while it was desirable in itself that she should be thus early roused to the sense of danger there might be in flooding these young creatures with this world's vanities, that wise old enemy Satan was on the alert to make the whole matter into thorns with which to prick Ruth's tired heart, and in obliging her thoughts to revolve around this center, never widening it nor seeing her way out of the maze, yet effectually shutting her off from the practical help which awaited her through the channel of Harry Morehouse's Bible. Somebody has said that, whoever else stays away from a religious meeting, Satan never does. Was there ever a truer statement? If he would only appear in his natural character, instead of, as in this instance, transforming himself into a goad and pressing hard against the nerves that were already strained to their utmost. On the whole, Mrs. Judge Burnham went home on the 5 o'clock train thoroughly wearied in body and mind, and with a haunting sense of disappointment pressing down her spirits. She had accomplished that which she had in the morning started to do. She had been successful in all her undertakings, and could feel that things were now in train for making transformation in the outward appearance of those hitherto neglected girls. A laudable undertaking, certainly, so it was held in its place, but she could not get her heart away from the sentence, "Endure labor for that which satisfieth not." End of chapter 22. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 23 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 23. Wherefore? Now, I am afraid you will laugh over the matter which appeared next to Ruth Burnham in the shape of a trial. Yet, if you have not lived long enough in this world to be in sympathy with the little trials, which, in certain states of mind, look large, either your experience is not extensive, or your sympathies not large. It was no greater matter than the hair which belonged to Judge Burnham's daughters. But really, if you could have seen the trying way in which they managed to disfigure their heads with this part of their adorning, you would have felt that some action was demanded. Ruth knew exactly how each head ought to be dressed. She could almost see the effect that would be produced by a skillful and easily attainable arrangement. Then where the trial? Why, perhaps if you are not made up of that cruelly sensitive type of women, and I am sure I hope you are not, it will be difficult to make plain to you how Ruth shrank from touching that hair. Human hair, other than her own, was a thing which she desired to keep at a respectful distance. She could admire it when well cared for, and she did most heartily, but to care for it, to comb and brush and fondle over any person's hair, was to Ruth, or would have been had she ever been called upon to suffer in that line, a positive martyrdom. Now add to this the fact that this shrinking from the work increased tenfold when it had to do with any person who was not very dear and precious, and possibly you can comprehend why she wore so troubled a face that Saturday evening, and gazed at those hopeless heads opposite her, and wondered how a transformation was to be brought about. She was hopeless as regarded teaching the intricacies of any becoming twist or curl. In time, with patience, and with often taking hold and obliging the refractory hairs to lie in their place, it might be accomplished, and here poor Ruth shivered over the horrors of a possible future experience. But to get them ready to appear at church the next morning, without a personal encounter, was not to be hoped for. This Saturday evening, although the family had been 3 weeks in their new home, was the first in which they were planning for church. The little church in the village had been closed for a longer space of time than that, undergoing repairs, and the first Sabbath after their marriage Ruth had contrived to plan and work herself into an exhaustive headache that had to be succumbed to and petted all day. The next they had been forced to spend in the city by reason of having missed the last train out on Saturday. Now here they were on the eve of the third, and Ruth, at least, had been planning toward the little stone church around the corner. Everything was in readiness. The new dresses and the new bonnets and the new gloves, and all the new and bewildering paraphernalia of the toilet had arrived from the city, the last package only the evening before, and but for that dreadful hair Ruth would have been happy over the thought of the effect to be produced by the next morning's toilet. It was Susan who at last, and in an unexpected manner, came to the rescue, just as she had stepped in and rescued Ruth from 100 trials, both seen and unseen, during the experiences of the last 3 weeks. She did her part so naturally, too, as one who simply happened along at the right moment, without having understood any special need for it. Perhaps there is no rarer or more perfect way of bearing one another's burdens than this apparently unconscious one. They sat in the cheery sitting-room. Ruth would not have called it a parlor, and in no part of the house had the transformation been more complete than in that square, rag-carpeted, paper-curtained, and unhomelike room. Judge Burnham was reading certain business letters that seemed to perplex him. The girls were wishing that they could invent some excuse for escaping early from the room to their own, that they might have another look at all the beauties of their wardrobe, and Ruth was gazing at them with a distressed air and manner, and thinking of hair. Susan, glancing up from her glove mending, followed the direction of Ruth's eyes for a moment, then she spoke her thoughts. "I just long to get hold of your hair." The remark seemed to be addressed to the two girls, and was so in keeping with Ruth's thoughts that she started and flushed, wondering for an instant whether it were possible for Susan to know what they were. The girls laughed and looked pleased at her interest. "Your hair would curl beautifully," Susan added, addressing the elder sister, "and those wide braids in which heavy hair is arranged now would just fit Minta's face. Don't you think so, Ruth?" "Yes," said Ruth, promptly. "I am sure of it, but I don't know that she could get them looped right." "Oh, yes, she could. It is very easy after one knows how. Girls, I am an excellent barber. Suppose we go upstairs and try my skill? I can show you so that you can arrange that part of your toilet in the morning in less time than it usually takes." This plan was immediately carried out, the three going upstairs with merry voices, Susan's cheery one being heard to say, "Oh, you don't understand half my accomplishments yet. There are ever so many things I can do." "That is a fact," said Judge Burnham with emphasis. "She is a very treasure in the house. I used to pity you, Ruth, but upon my word, so far as she is concerned, I am not sure that there was any room for pity." "There was not," Ruth said heartily. "It took me a long time to realize it, but she has been from the first day of her coming to our home a blessing to me." And so strange are these hearts of ours, touched oftentimes by words or deeds apparently so slight, Ruth felt the little episode of the hairdressing as something that called forth very tender feeling for her sister. She began to have a dim idea of what a blessing might be hidden in a simple, quiet life, constantly unselfish in so-called little things. So it came to pass that, on a lovely Sabbath morning, the Burnham family were one and all making ready to appear as a family in the little stone church. The girls had been there, more or less, on Sabbaths during their lives. Years ago Judge Burnham used to go occasionally, when he felt like it. But it had been many a year since he had been seen inside the unpretending little building. Ruth, of course, had never been, and the circumstances surrounding them all were so new and strange that it was almost like a company of strangers being introduced into home life together. The two girls came down a trifle earlier than the others, and were in the hall near the doorway, where the soft, yellow sunlight rested on them, when Judge Burnham descended the stairs. Halfway down he paused, with a surprised, irresolute air, as his eyes rested on the two apparent strangers, and then, as one of them turned suddenly, and he caught a glimpse of her face, the surprise deepened into bewilderment. Who were these young ladies who were so at home in his house in the privacy of a Sabbath morning? This was the first thought. And the second, "It is not. Can it be possible that they are my daughters?" Then it is almost surprising that he did not at once feel humiliated over the fact that outward adornings had power so to transform. It was certainly a transformation. Rich, quiet-toned silks, just the right tint to accord well with skin and eyes, made in that indescribable manner which marks the finished workman, to those eyes skilled in translating it, and to other eyes it simply says, the effect is perfect. Wraps, and hats, and gloves, and handkerchiefs, everything in keeping. And, in place of the stretched back hair, were soft, smooth, rolling auburn curls, completely changing the expression of the wearer's face. Also, that unbecoming mass of shortish hair which had hung in such untidy uncouthness, was gone, and in its place wide, smooth braids, tastefully looped here and there with knots of ribbon of just the right shade. Ruth should have been there at that moment to see the two, and to see Judge Burnham as he looked at them. She would have felt rewarded for her work. It certainly was strange what a different manner the hitherto awkward girls now assumed. A sense of conscious becomingness, if it were nothing more, had fallen upon them, and in the effort to do justice to their new selves they almost unconsciously drew the stooping shoulders straight and stood with heads erect. "Well, upon my word," said Judge Burnham, recovering himself at last and advancing toward them. "I didn't know you. I wondered what strange ladies we had here. Your fall suits are certainly very becoming." He chose to ignore the fact that fall suits were new experiences to them. Perhaps he really did not yet understand to what a new world they had been introduced. The two laughed, not unpleasantly, and the flush on their cheeks, toned as it was by the billows of soft rushings about the throat, was certainly not unbecoming. They had taken long looks at themselves in their mirror that morning, and it was not unpleasant to them to think that their father did not recognize them. They had already reached the place where they had no desire to have their past recognized. Some seed takes root promptly and grows rapidly. You may imagine that the entrance of the Burnham party to the little stone church was an event in the eyes of the congregation. They had known the Burnham girls all their lives, but these "young ladies" they never saw before. It would have been curious to a student of human nature to have studied the effect which their changed appearance made on the different characters present. Certain ones looked unaffected and unconcealed amazement; others gazed up at them and returned their nods of recognition with respectful bows, seeming to look upon them as people who had moved to an immense distance from themselves. And there were those who resented the removal, and tossed their heads and said, with their eyes, and the shape of their mouths, that they "considered themselves quite as good as those Burnham girls, if they were all decked out like peacocks." As for Judge Burnham, the shade of satisfied pride, in place of the mortification which he had schooled himself to feel, repaid his wife for her 3 weeks of effort. Then she tried to turn away from the question of personal appearance, and give herself to the service. But she was both surprised and pained to find that, in her well-meant efforts to place these girls in their proper position before others, she had, someway, lost ground spiritually. It was all very well to resolve to turn her thoughts away from the girls, and their dresses, and their bonnets, and their hair, and their manners, but it was another thing to accomplish it. She found what, possibly, we have each discovered by experience, that it was not easy to get away on Sabbath, in church, from that which had absorbed us during the week, and, indeed, a fair share of the early Sabbath itself. Try as she would to join in hymn, or Bible reading, or even prayers, she found her mind wandering to such trivial questions as whether, after all, a shade lighter of the silk would have fitted Minta's peculiar complexion better, or whether those gloves were not a trifle large. These thoughts were very hateful to her. She struggled hard to get away from them, and was amazed and distressed beyond measure to find that they held her captive. She waited eagerly for the sermon, hoping that it would be such an one as would hold her attention for her, since she was not able to control it herself. And behold, the text announced was one which, indeed, helped her wandering thoughts, but threw her back into the very midst of the gloom which had pressed her heart the last time she heard those words, "Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not?" Again her answering conscience said that was what she had been doing. Money and time and strength freely given for that which was not bread. It had not fed her soul. On the contrary, it, or something else, had starved her. Well, what was the trouble? She had surely done that which was her duty? Yes, but did a revealing spirit whisper the words in her ear just then? "These ought ye to have done, and not to have left the other undone." She had been absorbed in her labor. She had put these things first. She had risen and gone about the day, too hurried for other than a word of prayer, too hurried for any private reading. She had retired at night, too wearied in mind and body for any prayer at all. She was starved. Much time gone, and no bread for her hungry soul. Also, not having fed herself, how could she have been expected to feed others? Even yet she had said almost nothing, to these daughters of hers, about the all-important matter. She had talked with them, often and long. All the details of the toilet had been gone over carefully, exhaustively, and she and they, and Judge Burnham himself, were satisfied with the results of her words in that direction. What about the direction which satisfieth? How was Ruth to get away from her heart? No, I must do her justice. That was not her cry. She did not want to get away from the awakening voice. She was distressed, she was humiliated, she was unhappy, but she wanted to find rest only through the love and patience of Jesus. She felt like a sheep who had wandered outside, even while doing work that she surely thought was set for her, as indeed it was, but her eyes were just opening to the fact that one can do work that the Master has set so vigorously as to forget the resting places which he has marked for the soul to pause and commune with him and gather strength. She had been working, but not resting. And then, again, it was most painfully true that, because of her lack of spiritual strength, she had done but half her work. The important human side she had held to its important place, and worked faithfully for it. But the forever more important spiritual side she had allowed to sink almost out of sight of her vision; and even, when roused by his Spirit, as he had spoken to her through that very verse but a little time before, she had allowed her roused heart to slip back and absorb itself in the cares of this world and the adornments of fleshly bodies, while the souls waited. Truth to tell, Ruth was not troubled any more that morning by wandering thoughts; neither did she hear much of the earnest sermon which was preached. But if the preacher had but known how the Holy Spirit took his text and preached to one soul for him, he would have gone home to his closet, on his knees, and thanked God for using his lips that day in reading to that soul that questioning word. End of chapter 23. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 24 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 24. Hearken unto me. It passes my comprehension how a man with no more development of brain power than that one possesses made the mistake of thinking he was called to preach. This was what Judge Burnham said as he walked with his wife home from the morning service. Did you ever hear an effort more devoid of ideas? What possible good can he think he has accomplished, if that is his motive? Or how can he have sufficient vanity to imagine that it is rather than a bore to listen to him? Ruth hesitated for her answer. It was not that she had been so impressed with the sermon, it was rather the text that had been preached to her, and she did not feel personally sensitive in regard to Judge Burnham's opinion of this particular minister. I think the reason that the words struck sharply on her heart was because they revealed her husband's utter lack of sympathy with the subject matter of the sermon. He was speaking solely from a critical, intellectual standpoint, without, apparently, a conception of any spiritual power connected with the "foolishness of preaching." The sentence revealed to Ruth, as with a flash of light, such as reveals darkness, the fact that her husband had no sympathy with Christ or his servants as such. Of course, she had known this before; but to know a thing and to feel it are two very different matters. "I was not thinking of the newness of the truth," she said, after a little, speaking hesitatingly. "It impressed me, however. A thing does not need to be new in order to be helpful. It may be as old as the earth, and we never have given it attention." "Possibly," he said lightly. "There are things so old and so tiresome that we do not care to give them special attention. I am entirely willing to class that sermon among such, if you say so. I declare I had not realized that a sermon could be such a trial to me. I don't quite see what is to be done. I suppose your orthodoxy will not permit of your staying at home on Sabbath, and I'm sure we cannot tolerate that sort of preaching. I suppose he calls it preaching. How shall we manage?" Still Ruth had no answer ready. Every word that he spoke served to increase the heavy weight at her heart; and, despite her shivering effort to get away from it, there rang the question, "How can two walk together except they be agreed?" Yet she realized only too well that the time for settling that question was long past, that she had taken solemn and irrevocable vows upon her, and must abide by them. The question now was, how was she so to walk with him as not to dishonor Christ? "I have no fault to find with the man's preaching," she said coldly, and her husband laughed good-naturedly, and told her he appreciated her well-meant efforts to make the best of everything, but, unfortunately, she had too much brain to allow him for a moment to believe that such weak attempts at oratory satisfied her. Then he changed the subject, talking of matters as foreign to Ruth's thoughts as possible, and yet serving, by their very distance from her heart, to press the weight of pain deeper. Her eyes once widely opened, it seemed that everything which occurred that day served to show her more plainly the gulf which lay between her ideas and plans and hopes, and those of her husband. "What a glorious day this is!" he had said, as they turned from the dinner table. "I declare I believe the country is ahead of the city, on such days as these, anyway. Ruth, what do you say to a ride? It would be a good time to explore that winding road which seemed to stretch away into nowhere." While he waited, he watched with surprise the flush which deepened and spread on his wife's face. It so happened that the question of Sabbath riding for pleasure was one which had come up incidentally for discussion one evening at Flossy Shipley's, during Mr. Roberts' visit, and Ruth, who had taken the popular view of innocent Sabbath recreation, had discussed the matter with keen relish, finding Mr. Roberts able to meet her at every point. She had been first annoyed to find her position open to so much objection, then interested to study the question in all its bearings, and ended, as such a frank, intelligent, and thoroughly sincere nature as hers must end, in abandoning a position which she saw was untenable, and coming strongly over to the other side, since which time the observance of the Sabbath had been one of her strong points. Judge Burnham had respected her scruples so far as he knew them, but, truth to tell, he did not understand them very well. Having no personal principle in the matter by which to judge, he was in danger of erring in unthought of directions, and every new phase of the same question demanded a new line of reasoning. It had not so much as occurred to him that his wife would see any impropriety in riding out in her own carriage on the Sabbath day with her husband on a quiet, unfrequented country road. While she hesitated he watched her curiously. "Well," he said, laughing at last, "what is the trouble? You look as though I had broken all the commands in the Decalogue. Am I on forbidden ground now?" "Not all the commands," Ruth said, trying to smile, "but you seem to have forgotten the fourth." "I am not sure that I know it. I am not thoroughly posted as to the commandments. The position in which they stand, at least. What is wrong, Ruth?" "Judge Burnham, I don't like to ride out for pleasure on Sabbath." "What, not with me? Is it wicked to have a pleasant time on Sabbath? I didn't know that. I fail to see why we can't be as good sitting together in the carriage as we are sitting together in the parlor. Or should we spend this day apart, enjoying the luxury of melancholy reflection?" "I think you know what I mean. You are much too well versed in argument to be entirely ignorant of people's views in regard to this day." "Upon my word, Ruth, I was never more innocent. I might be able to see some force in a young lady's objection to riding out with a young gentleman, especially in a city, or in a crowded thoroughfare, though even such things may be carried to excess. But when it comes to one's husband, and a country road where we shall not meet 3 people in an hour, I confess I am befogged. Susan, do you see the bearings of this case?" "Why, I see a good many bearings which you would not admit, and possibly you could bring to bear a good many arguments which I would not admit. We start from different standpoints. It all resolves itself into whether we believe the Word of God or not, and I accept it as our rule of life." "Why, no, it doesn't. I believe the Word of God, in a measure at least. I have respect for the Sabbath as an institution, and believe in its sacredness. I have no sort of fault to find with 'Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.' I believe it was a good, sensible law. But we should very likely quarrel over the word 'holy.' I would object to the narrowness which made it so falsely holy that I could not enjoy a ride with my wife after church, and I should have serious doubts as to whether you could prove your side of the question from the Bible." "Listen to one Bible argument, then," Susan said quietly, "and tell me what you think it means. 'If thou turn away thy foot from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words.' What do you think of that argument for my side, Judge Burnham?" The gentleman addressed looked his embarrassment and annoyance. The verse quoted sounded strangely new and solemn to him. His inner consciousness was made certain that he was not ready to gauge his Sabbath employments by that rule. "Oh, well," he said restlessly, "that verse would have to affect other things besides riding out in the country. It has to do with home life, and words, and acts as well." "It certainly has," Susan answered, and she spoke as if she thought it in no degree lessened the force of the argument because the obligation reached in many directions. "I suppose," Ruth said, "there is no question but the Sabbath is very poorly observed. Still that is hardly an argument for increasing the ways of dishonoring it, is it?" Then Judge Burnham turned on his heel and went off to the piazza, deigning no reply to the general question that his wife had put. As for herself, she struggled with the sense of pain that kept increasing, and wondered how she should shape her life. Apparently, Judge Burnham became ashamed of his rudeness, for he returned presently to the parlor, whither Ruth had gone to wait for him, and seating himself near her, with some pleasant remark as far removed from the recent subject as he could make it, took up a book and seemed to lose himself in it. Ruth followed his example, the book she took being the elegantly bound Bible that her father had sent to grace the table. Instinctively she turned to the chapter from which the haunting verse came, and slowly, carefully read it over. Presently what had been a pretense with Judge Burnham became reality. He was interested in his book, which interest he evidenced by a burst of laughter. "This is really rich," he said. "Listen to this sarcasm, Ruth. See if you ever heard anything touch deeper." And then he read from the sparkling, satirical, popular writer a dozen sentences of brilliant sarcasm concerning one of the scientific questions of the day, keen, sharp, sparkling with wit and strength, but having to do with a subject for which Ruth had no sympathy at any time, and which especially jarred upon her this Sabbath afternoon. Her husband looked up from his reading to meet the answering flash of the eyes which he liked so well to see kindle, and met the objection on her face, and felt the lack of sympathy with his enjoyment. "I beg your pardon," he said abruptly. "I had forgotten your Puritan ideas. Possibly I am infringing again on the sacredness of your Sabbath." "I certainly think that the sentiments of that book are not in accordance with the Bible idea of the sacredness of the day." If Ruth could only have kept her voice from sounding as cold as an iceberg, she might have had some influence. As it was, he arose with a decided frown on his fine face. "I see, Ruth," he said, speaking as coldly as she had herself, "that we assuredly have nothing in common for this day of the week, whatever may be said of us on other days. It is a pity that the sacredness of the Sabbath should be the only element of discord between husband and wife. As I am in continual danger of erring unconsciously, I will have the grace to leave you in solitude and religious enjoyment." And with a courtly bow he left her to herself, and her large open Bible, and her sad heart. A little later Susan came in, and stopping beside her looked down the page of the Bible. Ruth laid her finger on the words of the morning text. "It is all true, Susan," she said gravely. "I don't believe there is any person living who realizes it more fully than I do. That which satisfieth not. One may do one's best, and succeed in accomplishing, and it is unsatisfying." "Have you answered the question, Ruth, dear?" "Whose question?" "The Holy Spirit's. 'Wherefore do ye?' That is what he asks. Do you understand why we try to satisfy our souls on husks instead of wheat?" "Well," Ruth said thoughtfully, "things have to be done." "Of course, but why should we stop among the things expecting satisfaction, or allow them to take other than the subordinate place they are meant to occupy? Ruth, I think the trouble with you is, you do not read the whole verse. You feel that you have proved the truth of the first part of it, in your own experience. Why don't you try the rest?" "Just what do you mean?" "Why, listen. 'Hearken unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness.' Don't you see what an assurance that is, that the feast is spread? There is prepared that which will satisfy. Why not hearken to the voice of the Master of the feast?" Ruth lifted to her sister's face earnest eyes that filled with tears. "I have tried to hearken," she said, in a voice that was husky with feeling. "I have heard his voice, and have tried to follow him, and, at times, as I have told you before, he has seemed very near; but the feeling does not stay. I am up on the mount one day, more than satisfied, and the next day I have dropped down and lost my comfort." "Yes, I know that story in all its details. I have lived it. In my own case it was because I ceased hearkening for his voice. I placed other things first. I thought first of what I was going to do, or have, or be, instead of putting Christ first." "Ruth, don't you know he says, 'For I the Lord thy God am a jealous God'? How often I have thought of that! He will not abide with a divided heart. He must be first. And, for myself, I did not for years keep him first. God was not in all my thoughts." "I don't know," Ruth said, speaking slowly after a long silence, and she spoke with a long drawn sigh. "I don't know that I can ever get back to where I was, even 3 weeks ago. Something has dropped like a pall upon my joy in religion. I never had much joy in anything. Really, it isn't in my nature to be joyful. Perhaps I should not expect it." Susan, smiling, shook her head. "That won't do, you know. Joy is one of the fruits that you are commanded to bear. It is not optional with you. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, you remember. It is not the joy of nature that you and I are to look for, but the joy of grace. Ruth, if I were you, I would not try to go back to 3 weeks ago. I would try to go back to Christ, and ask him to hold you, and lead you, and speak for you, and in this, your time of special need, not to let you drop for one moment away from him." But who shall account for the perversity of the human heart? Something in the simple, earnest words were translated by Satan to mean to Ruth a reflection against her husband. She lifted her head haughtily, and the tremor went out of her voice. "I don't know what you mean by my 'time of special need.' I do not know that one's life, humanly speaking, could be more carefully shielded than mine. I have no anxiety as to Judge Burnham's position in regard to these questions. He will respect my wishes and follow my plans." To this Susan had no answer. Had she spoken at all, she feared she would have shown Ruth that her own words were not strictly true. She believed her at this moment to be weighed down with a sense of her husband's influence over her. When the bell tolled for evening service, Susan and the 2 daughters of the house came down attired for church. "Going again?" queried Judge Burnham with uplifted eyebrows. "Ruth and I have had enough for to-day." And Ruth, sitting back in an easy chair, with a footstool at her feet, and a sofa pillow at her head, and a volume of sacred poems in her hand, neither raised her eyes nor spoke. "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." This sentence stayed persistently with Susan Erskine. What had it to do with Judge Burnham and his wife that they, too, should remind her of it? Chapter 25 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 25. Bitter Sweet. A question which began to press heavily on Ruth's mind as the days went by was, what should she do when Susan went home? It began to be apparent that all the details connected with the reconstructed house were completed, and also that a skillful set of hired helpers were in their places. but it was equally apparent to her heart that she shrank from the thought of seeing Susan pack her trunk and go back to the Erskine homestead. She fitted so perfectly into the family life. She had already acquired such a remarkable degree of influence over the girls. They copied her ways and her words, and it had some time ago become apparent to Ruth that this sister of hers was in every respect worthy of being copied. Even her dress, taking its hints from Flossy Shipley's sweetly spoken words, about which Ruth knew nothing, had taken such quietness of tone that, if it was not marked for its beauty, had perhaps higher praise in that it was not noticed at all, but had sunken into the minor place it was expected to fill. Ruth, in thinking the past all over, was amazed at the wholesale way in which she had finally adopted her sister. Just when she began to like her so well that it was a pleasure to have her company and a trial to think of her absence, she did not know. It seemed to her now as though she had always felt so, and yet she knew that somewhere along the line of her life there must have been a decided change of feeling. "She is just splendid, anyway." This was the final verdict. "I don't care when I began to know it. I know it now. I wish I could have her with me always. If she and father could live out here with us, how nice it would be. Father would like the country. It would rest and strengthen him. But oh, that woman!" Which two words, spoken with an intensity of emphasis that she allowed only the four walls of her room to hear, always referred to Mrs. Judge Erskine. She was quite as much of a trial as ever. Ruth could not conceive of a possibility of there ever being a time when she should want to see her. So she studied over the problem of how to keep Susan, and, like many another student, found, after a few days, that it was worked out for her in a way that she would not have chosen. The news burst like a bombshell into their midst without note or warning. Judge Erskine had lost his fortune! Large though it had been, it slipped out of his grasp almost in an hour. "The trouble has to do with the smallpox and religion," Judge Burnham said with something very like a sneer on his handsome face. "I don't know which development should be blamed the most. During his exile from the office, his clerks made some very foolish moves as regarded investments, etc. And then the other disease reached such a form that he was beguiled into putting his name to 2 or 3 pieces of paper for others on the score of friendship, a piece of idiocy that during all his sane years he had warned me, and every other business man who came to him for advice, from being beguiled into, and the result is financial ruin." "There are worse ruins than that." Ruth said it haughtily. Her husband's criticism of her father jarred. "Oh, that is true enough. There are dishonorable ruins. This one is the soul of honor, and of philanthropy for that matter. He has so much to sustain him, but he can't live on it. And, Ruth, if you had ever known what it was to live on nothing, you could sympathize better with that sort of ruin. The hard part for me to bear would be that it was all so unnecessary. If he had but lived up to the wisdom and business keenness which characterized all the earlier years of his life. He has taken to giving some very strange advice to his clients since he subscribed to his new views, advice which has taken thousands of dollars out of his business. Had to do it, he told me. His conscience wouldn't allow him to do otherwise. If that is true, I am really afraid that I couldn't afford to have a conscience. It is too expensive an article." How much of this was sincere, and how much was a sort of sarcastic pleasantry? Ruth wished she knew. It was a new and rather startling thought that possibly the money which sustained her now had to do with the fact that her husband couldn't afford a sensitive conscience. She put the thought away, as far from her as possible. At least, she could do nothing with it now. The time for it was past. She tried not to think what ground she had for expecting a high type of conscience from one who lived in cool dishonor of the claims of the Lord Jesus Christ. The immediate questions were, what would her father do? Also, what was there that she could do for him? "Oh, he will give everything up," Judge Burnham said. "Every penny, house and landed property and household goods, down to his very dog. Even his clothing is in danger. I saw it in his eyes. It is the disease which has pervaded his system. This new conscience of his won't let him do anything sensible." "Judge Burnham," said Ruth, having endured all that she could — she was not skilled in endurance — "I wish you would remember that you are speaking of my father, and refrain from sneers. If his code of honor is higher than yours, he cannot help it, I suppose. At least, you should be able to respect it, or, failing in that, please respect my feelings." "I beg your pardon," said Judge Burnham, quickly startled by the repressed fierceness of the tones. "I did not mean to hurt your feelings, Ruth, but you do not understand business, and your father is really being very absurd with his strained ideas of equity." "I understand conscience somewhat," Ruth said quickly, and she was stung with the thought that perhaps in the days gone by she had stifled hers. Now all this was certainly very sad talk to come between husband and wife not 6 weeks after their marriage. Ruth felt it and deplored it and wept over it, and wondered how it would be possible to avoid subjects on which they did not think and feel alike. Meantime she ought to go and see her father. From this she shrank. How could she talk with him from any other standpoint than that in which she had always known him? A man of wealth and power in the business world, she felt that he must be utterly bowed down. He had always, in a lofty, aristocratic way, attached full importance to wealth. How was he going to endure being suddenly thrown to the bottom of the ladder, when he had for so many years rested securely on the top round? However, it was folly for her to avoid such an evident duty. She chose an hour when Mrs. Erskine would be undoubtedly engaged downstairs, and slipped away to the train, having said nothing of her intention to her husband when he went to town an hour before, and without having as yet succeeded in arranging a single sentence that she felt would be helpful to her father, she suddenly and silently presented herself before him in the little room off the library, which was sacred to his private use. He sat at the table writing, his face pale indeed, but quiet, not exactly cheerful, yet certainly peaceful. He glanced up as the door opened, and then arose quickly. "Well, daughter," he said, "you have come to see father in his trouble. That is right. Come in, dear, and have a seat." And with the old-time courtesy he drew an easy chair for her and waited while she seated herself. Then he sat down again in his large arm-chair before her. "Yes," he said, "I must begin again. I shall not get to where I was before. On your account I regret it. I wanted to leave you a fortune to do good with, but your husband has enough, and it is all right. The Lord can choose what money he will have spent for him." "You certainly need not think of me, father. As you say, Judge Burnham has enough." And even at this moment there was a pang in Ruth's heart that she would not have had her father see for worlds, as she wondered how much power she could have over his wealth to turn it into sources for good. "My chief anxiety is, what are you going to do?" "Well," he said, and there was a gleam of a smile on his face, "I am going to climb up again with my wife's help. It isn't poverty, you know, thanks to her. Isn't it marvelous how she can have saved so much out of the paltry yearly sums? Haven't you heard about it? Why, she actually has at interest about $14,000, invested in my name, too. Isn't that a reward for the indignities I heaped upon her?" His voice broke, and the tears started in his eyes. "I tell you," he said tremulously, "I bore it all better than that. I knew I was not to blame for the financial downfall, but to find that the woman whom I had wronged had been all these years heaping coals of fire on my head just unmanned me." And he wiped the great tears from his cheeks, while Ruth moved restlessly in her seat. She did not like to hear about his having wronged that woman, neither did she like to have her father beholden to her for support. "It is fortunate that she saved it," she said, and her voice was most unsympathetic. "But, after all, father, it is your money." "No, daughter, no, not a penny of it. 10 times that sum ought to belong to her." Think of trying to make money repair the injury which I was doing her! But it is most comforting to feel that I am to be beholden to her rather than to any other human being." Ruth did not think so. "I have been wonderfully sustained, Ruth," her father continued. "I said last night that it was almost worth losing a fortune to see how calmly the Lord Jesus could hold me. I haven't had a doubt nor an anxiety as to its being the right way from the first hour that I knew of the loss. Of course, I don't see why it should come, and really, I don't believe I care to know. Why should I, when I can so entirely trust to His wisdom and love? There is another thing, daughter. The sweet came with the bitter, and was so much more important that it overbalanced. Do you know that your mother had come into the sunlight of His love? She told me about it that very evening, and she says she owes her knowledge of the way to me. Isn't that a wonderful boon for the Lord to bestow on such as I?" Ruth turned almost away from him, with an unaccountable irritability tugging at her heart. Your mother! He had never used those words to her before. They had slipped out now unconsciously. He had grown used to their sound in speaking to Susan. He did not see how they jarred. It frightened his daughter to realize how little she seemed to care whether a soul had been new born or not. She could not take in its importance. "I am sure I am very glad," she said, but her voice bore not the slightest trace of gladness. Then she went home, feeling that her spirit was not in accord with the tone of that house. "He doesn't need my comfort," she told herself, and she said it almost bitterly. It was true enough, he didn't. Not that he did not appreciate human sympathy and human love, but a greater than human strength had laid hold upon his weakness, and he was upborn. This, too, Ruth recognized, and even while she rejoiced in it, there mingled with the joy a strange pain. Following the money downfall came plans that were quite in accord with her wishes. They sprang into being apparently through a chance remark. It began with Ruth, in a heavy sigh, as she said, she and Susan being alone, "I don't know how to take the next step for those girls. It is absurd to think of sending them to school. At their age, and with their limited knowledge, they would be simply objects of ridicule. We must find a resident governess for them. But where to look for one who will have to teach young ladies what, in these days, quite little children are supposed to know, and yet remember that they are young ladies, and treat them as such, is a puzzle. I am sure I don't know where to look, nor how to describe what we need, the circumstances are so peculiar." Then she waited for Susan to answer, and so accustomed had she grown to being helped by that young lady's suggestions, that she waited hopefully, though without having the least conception of how a comparative stranger in the city could help in this emergency. "There are plenty to get," Susan said. "At least I suppose the world is full of teachers, if you only knew just where to look for them." "Oh, teachers! Yes, there are plenty of them, if a teacher was all that was needed. But, you know, Susan, the case is a very unusual one. We really need a woman who knows a good deal about everything, and who is as wise as a serpent. There is a chance to ruin the girls, and make trouble for Judge Burnham and misery for me, if we do not get just the right sort of person; and I am in doubt as to whether there is any right sort to be had." Whereupon Susan laughed and blushed a little, as she said, "After such an alarming statement of the requirements, I am not sure that I have the courage to propose a friend of mine. She doesn't lay claim to any of the gifts which you suggest." Ruth looked up, relieved and smiling. "Do you really know a teacher, Susan, whom you can recommend? I forgot that your acquaintance was extensive among scholars. You need not hesitate to suggest, for I assure you that your recommendation would go further with Judge Burnham and myself than any one we know, for you understand the situation, and your judgment is to be relied upon. Of whom are you thinking, and where is she to be found? I can almost promise her a situation." Whereupon Susan laughed outright. "Really," she said, "you make it very embarrassing work for me. I not only have to recommend myself, but actually force myself upon your observation. But since I intend to teach in the future, as I have done in the past, Why not try me for a while, since I am here? I think I would do until the girls were ready for somebody who could do better." If she had been watching her sister's face, she would have seen the puzzled look change to one of radiant delight. Then that sister did what, to one of her undemonstrative nature, was a strange thing to do. She crossed to Susan's side, and bending down, kissed her eagerly on either cheek. "I believe I am an idiot," she said, "though I used to think I was capable of planning as well as most persons, but I never once thought of it. And I knew you meant to teach, too. It is the very thing. Nothing could be more delightful. Judge Burnham will think so, too. Oh, Susan, you are one of my greatest comforts." End of chapter 25. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 26 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 26. These be thy gods. At last in Ruth Burnham's home, life settled into routine. Everything was as she had planned it. She had tried 2 ways of life. For a season, almost everything had gone contrary to her desires and plans. Then there came this period wherein she was permitted to carry out, in detail, all the schemes which seemed to her wise. In the earlier days of her Christian experience she had felt, if she did not say, that if she could but have the control of her own affairs, humanly speaking, she could make things work together in a different and more helpful manner for herself and her friends. It was as if the Lord had taken her at her word and opened the door for her to plan and carry out according to her will. The question was, did she find it a success? Was she now, at last, a happy, growing Christian, one whose influence was felt in all the departments of her life? Oh, I am afraid that Ruth hated to admit, even to her own heart, how far from success she felt. Painful though the admission was, she had to make it to her conscience that she was neither a growing nor a happy Christian. What was the trouble? Why, in her heart and in her life there was conflict. She knew the right, and too often she did it not. Give me such an experience as that, and you may be sure that you have given the record of an unhappy and an unfruitful life. There were so many ways in which Ruth could see that she had erred. She meant to commence in just the right way. She had taken great credit to herself for her sacrifice of personal ease and pleasure, for the taking up of hard crosses in connection with Judge Burnham's duties, yet now she saw that there were crosses far more important which she had not taken up at all. Almost as soon as she knelt alone in her own room to pray, she knelt in tears. First, because she was always alone, her husband never bowed with her, never read the Bible with her. Was this, in part, her fault? What if, in those first days when everything was new, and when he was on the alert to be her comfort, she had asked him to read with her, to kneel with her, and hear her pray? Was it not possible that he might have done so? Well, those first days were not so long gone by. Was it not just possible that he might join her now? Alas for Ruth! Though the days of her marriage life had been so few, she could look back upon them and see inconsistencies in word and manner and action which went far toward sealing her lips. Not that they should, but is it not the painful experience of each one of us that they so often do? If Ruth had but commenced right! It is so hard to make a beginning in the middle of a life. Besides, there had been many words spoken by Judge Burnham which would serve to make it harder for him to yield to any innovations. If she had but beguiled him before these words were spoken! Then, indeed, it is possible that some of them at least should never have been uttered. Only a few weeks a wife, and for how many of her husband's sins was she already in a measure responsible? Then the girls were a source of pain to Ruth's conscience. Not that they had not learned well her first lessons. It surprised, at times it almost alarmed her, to see with what eagerness they caught at the ribbons and ruffles, and all the outside adornments of life. They were entirely willing to give these, each and all, important place in their thoughts. She had given them intoxicating glimpses of the world of fashion, before their heads or hearts were poised enough not to be overbalanced. They had caught at the glimpse and made a fairyland of beauty out of it, and had resolved with all their young, strong might to belong to that fairyland, and they looked up to and reverenced Ruth as the queen who had the power of opening these enchanted doors to them. You are to remember that, though backward, they were by no means brainless. Having been kept in such marked seclusion all their lives, until this sudden opening of the outer doors upon them, and this sudden flinging them into the very midst of the whirl of what to wear and how to make it, hearing little else during these first bewildering days than the questions concerning this shade or that tint, and the comparative merits of ruffles or plaits, and the comparative qualities of silks and velvets, and the absolute necessity of perfect fitting boots and gloves and hats, what wonder that they jumped to the conclusion that these things were the marks of power in the world, and were second in importance to nothing? Having plunged into her work with the same energy which characterized all Ruth's movements, how was she now to teach the lesson that these things were absolutely as nothings compared with 100 other questions having to do with their lives? She worked at this problem, and saw no more how to do it than she saw how to take back the first few weeks of married life and personal influence over her husband and live them over again. There was no solace in trying to talk her difficulties over with Susan, because she, while intensely sympathetic in regard to everyday matters, was gravely silent when Ruth wondered why the girls were so suddenly absorbed in the trivialities of life to the exclusion of more important things. And Ruth felt that her sister recognized her share in the matter, and deplored it. About her husband she chose to be entirely silent herself. If pride had not kept her so, the sense of wifely vows would have sealed her lips. At least she had high and sacred ideas of marriage vows. Alas for Ruth, there were other disquieting elements. She realized her husband's influence on herself. Try as she would, resolve as she might, steadily she slipped away from her former moorings. Little things, so called, were the occasions of the lapses, but they were not little in their effect on her spiritual life. How is it possible that you can desire to go to that stuffy little room and meet a dozen illiterate men and women, or is it a mistaken sense of duty which impels you? This was her husband's question regarding the suggestion of Ruth that they go to the weekly prayer meeting. His tone was not unkind, but there was just a touch of raillery in it, which was at all times harder for Ruth to bear than positive coldness. "You must be content to tolerate my tastes," she said, "since you cannot sympathize with them. Endurance is the most that I can expect." He laughed good-naturedly. "Now, Ruth dear, don't be cross. I haven't the least idea of being so, and I propose to humor your whims to the last degree. I will even escort you to that most uninviting room, and call for you again, enduring meantime, with what grace I can, the sorrows of my country solitude. What more can you expect? But in return for such magnanimity, you might enlighten my curiosity. Why do you go? How can I help being curious? In town, now, it was different. While I might even there question your choice of entertainments, at least you met people of culture, with whom you had certain ideas in common. But really and truly, my dear wife, I am at home in this region of country, so far as knowledge of the mental caliber of the people is concerned, and I assure you, you will look in vain for a man or woman of brains. Outside of the minister, who is well enough I suppose, though he is a perfect bore to me, there is a general and most alarming paucity of ideas. Besides which, there is no gas in the church, you know, and kerosene lamps are fearful at their best, and these, I judge, are at their worst. So, taking the subject in all its bearings, I think I am justified in asking what can be your motive?" Is it any wonder that there were tears in Ruth's eyes as she turned them toward her husband? How to explain to one who would not understand the meaning of her terms, why she sought the little country prayer meeting? "Judge Burnham," she said, speaking slowly, and trying to choose words with care, "is it unknown to you that I profess to expect to meet there with the Lord Jesus Christ?" "Oh, that indeed!" he said, and the lightness of his tone so jarred on her that she shivered. "I believe there is an article in your creed. I don't discredit it in its intellectual and spiritual sense, but what does it prove? I suppose you meet him equally in this room, and I suppose the surroundings of this room are as conducive to communication with the unseen presence as are those of that forlorn little square box of a church. Isn't that the most doleful building for a church that it was ever your misery to see? It is abominably ventilated. For that matter, churches nearly always are. I wonder if there is anything in church creeds that conscientiously holds people from observing the laws of health and comfort. I don't believe there is an opera house in the United States that would be tolerated for a season if the question of light and heat and ventilation had been ignored in it as entirely as they are in churches." What was there to be said to such as he? Perhaps Ruth said the best thing under the circumstances. "Well, come, don't let us discuss this subject further. There is the bell. Please take me down to the poor little church, for I really want to go." "Certainly," he said, rising promptly, and making ready with a good-natured air. He attended her to the very door, and was on its threshold in waiting when the hour of prayer was over, and was gracious and attentive in the extreme during the rest of the evening, making no allusion to the prayer meeting after the first few mischievous and pointed questions as to the exercises, questions which tried Ruth's nerves to the utmost, for the reason that the little meeting had been so utterly devoid of anything like life and earnestness that it was a trial rather than a help to her. Conversations not unlike these were common on prayer-meeting evening, always conducted on Judge Burnham's part in the most gracious spirit, ending by accompanying her to the church door. She ceased to ask him to enter, for the reason that she was not sure but it would be a positive injury to him to do so. One Wednesday evening he followed her to the parlor with a petition. "Now, wifey, I have been most patiently good every meeting evening, since I had you all to myself, having given you up, if not willingly, at least uncomplainingly, to the companionship of those who are neither elevating nor inspiriting. Now it is your turn to show yourself unselfish. I am a victim to one of my old-fashioned headaches to-night, and want you to take care of me." To which proposition Ruth instantly agreed, the pang of conscience which she felt being not on account of the wife's obvious duty to care for a sick husband, but because of the instant throb of relief of which she was conscious in having a legitimate reason for escaping the prayer meeting. It was too painfully apparent, even to her own heart, that she had not enjoyed the hour of religious communion, that she had sighed inwardly when the door closed after her retreating husband, and she had gone back eagerly to his companionship directly after the hour of separation was over. It transpired that, on this occasion, his headache was not so severe, but that it admitted of his being entertained by his wife's voice reading aloud, and he was presently so far recovered as to sit up and join in her reading, giving her a lesson in the true rendering of Shakespeare, which was most enjoyable to both. On the following Wednesday there was a concert of unusual interest in the city, and Ruth obeyed her husband's summons by telegraph to come down on the 6 o'clock train and attend. Of course, it would not do to have him wait in the city for her and disappoint him. Another Wednesday and she went again to the little meeting, but it had in the interim grown more distasteful to her, and, indeed, there was this excuse for poor Ruth, that the meeting was one of the dullest of its kind. There were no outside influences helping her. It was a matter of hard duty between her and her conscience. Perhaps when we consider that human nature is what it is, we should not think it strange that 6 weeks after the concert found Ruth accepting an invitation to a select party in town, forgetting utterly, until in her estimation the acceptance was beyond recall, that it was Wednesday evening. When she remembered it, she told her long-suffering conscience somewhat roughly, that "wives certainly had duties which they owed to their husbands." I have given you now only a specimen out of many influences which slowly and surely drew Ruth downstream. Susan, looking on, feeling for the present powerless, except as that ever-present resource, prayer, was left her, felt oftener perhaps than any other command, the force of that one sentence. "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Yet was not Ruth Burnham happy. Perhaps she had never, in her most discontented hours, been further from happiness. Her conscience was too enlightened, and had, in the last 2 years, been too well cultivated for her not to know that she was going contrary very often to her former ideas of right. Too surely she felt that her husband's views, her husband's tastes, her husband's plans of life were at variance with hers. It was all very well to talk about his yielding and being led. He could yield to the inevitable, and there is a way of appearing to yield, gracefully too, which develops itself as only a master stroke to the end that one may gain one's own way. This method Judge Burnham understood in all its details. His wife early in their married life began to realize it. She began to understand that he was, in a quiet, persistent way, actually jealous of the demands which her religion made upon her time and heart. It was not that he deliberately meant to overthrow this power which held her. Rather, he sought in a patient way to undermine it. Perhaps if Ruth had realized this, she might have been more on her guard. But Satan had succeeded in blinding her eyes by that most specious of all reasonings that she must, by her concession to his tastes and plans, win him over to her ways of thinking. In other words, she must, by doing wrong, convince him of the beauty that there was in a consistent Christian life, and win him to the right way. In matters pertaining to this life Ruth's lip would have curled in scorn over such logic. Why was it that she could not see plainly the ground whereon she trod? Is there, then, no rest in the Christian life? Is the promise, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest," utterly void and worthless? Has not God called his children to peace? Is there no peace which passeth understanding, such as the world can neither give nor take away? Why did not Ruth Burnham, with her educated mind and clear brain, ponder these things, and determine whether, when she told herself, that of course one must expect conflict and heart wars in this life, she was not thereby making the eternal God false to his covenants? What was the trouble? Why, the same thing which comes in so continually with its weary distractions, a divided heart. Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. That old solemn truth remains today, after 1800 years of experience, a truth which many a world-tossed soul has proved. And Ruth Burnham had need to learn that it matters not whether the world be represented by a General Glitter or by a loving husband, so that the object of special choice was placed before him, solemn effect must follow. End of chapter 26. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 27 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 27. The Baptism of Suffering. In the course of time it became to Susan Erskine, who was watching with eager interest the story of her sister's life, a question of painful moment as to how the watchful Christ would come to the rescue of his straying sheep. For, as the days passed, it grew most painfully apparent that Ruth was straying. She did not gain in the least. This being the case, it is of course equivalent to saying that she lost. Steadily her husband proved the fact that his was the stronger nature, and that he was leading, not being led. Yet his wife did not get entirely out of the way, not far enough out, indeed, to claim the few pitiful returns that the world has for service. She stayed always in that wretched middle state, not belonging to the world fully, nor yet fully to Christ. Hence continuous soreness of heart, developing alternately in gloom and irritability. There came at last a messenger to her home and heart, a little, tender, helpless one, just helpless enough and clinging enough to gather all the tendrils of the heart around and bind them closely. How that baby was loved! There have been babies loved before, many a heart has bowed before the shrine of such an idol. But perhaps never baby, from grandfather down to the little hired nurse, whose duty it was in the course of time to keep said baby amused, had such patient, persistent, willing slaves as had this young heir of the house of Burnham. As for Ruth, she found that she had never even dreamed of the depth of mother love. A sort of general interest in healthy, cleanly, well-dressed children had been one of her pastimes. She had imagined herself somewhat fond of certain types of childhood, while aware that she shrank in horror from certain other types. But this new, strange rush of emotions which filled her heart almost to bursting was an experience of which she had had no conception. From that hour those who watched Ruth anxiously to see whether the sweet young life which was a part of herself would win her back to her covenant vows, saw with ever-deepening pain that this new-born soul was only another and a stronger idol. With all the fierceness of her strong nature, with all the unrest of her dissatisfied heart, did the mother bow before this tiny soul and bring it worship. She discovered at last that self-sacrifice was easy, that sleepless nights and restless days and the pressure of many cares and responsibilities were as nothing, provided baby's comfort demanded any or all of these. Now she withdrew entirely from the prayer meetings and ceased her fitful attempts at being identified with the Sabbath school. She was even most rare in her attendance on the regular Sabbath service. Did not baby require a mother's care? This was her trust, God-given surely, if anything ever was, and therefore she was to consider it as a work from Him. There is no error so fatal as a half-truth. To be sure, this theory was not carried out in all respects. The mother found time for social life. She was seen frequently at concerts and lectures and entertainments of various sorts, but this, she said, was a duty she owed to her husband. And it really seemed as though there were no voice left in her heart to remind her that the duties she owed to Christ were being neglected. And Susan, watching and waiting, began to ask her heart half fearfully, how will He speak to her next? That He would speak to her, and that effectually, she fully believed, for Ruth was surely one of His own. How strange that she would wander and make it necessary for the shepherd to seek her with bleeding feet, over the mountains, wild and bare, instead of resting securely and sweetly within the fold. Meantime, the domestic machinery of the Burnham household worked more smoothly than it is always wont to do under the peculiar family relations. Ruth, whatever her faults, was fully alive to the special cause of comfort in her household. She never ceased to realize that one of the greatest blessings of her lot in life was the sudden descent upon her of a sister. Such a faithful, thoughtful, self-sacrificing sister, one who really seemed to be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove. Even Ruth, though she had an idea that she fully appreciated her, did not see the extent of her influence over those untutored girls. Daily her power over them increased. The development in them mentally was something of which their father was unceasingly proud. Not the less, perhaps, did it give him satisfaction, because there was coupled with it a development of refinement of tone and manner, a growing sense of the fitness of things, and an evident and hearty relish for the advantages which his wealth was able to afford them. Over one thing Susan pondered and prayed, and watched with no little anxiety. The girls were willing to be her pupils in any other study save that of personal religion. They were in a degree interested in Bible study, they by no means shrank from it. They respected her views, they talked freely with her as to creeds and doctrines, but when it came to pressing their personal need of Christ as a Savior from sin, they were strangely apathetic. Had they inherited their father's distaste for all the personalities of religion? Susan questioned. Or had their first delicious glimpse of this new world, given under the new mother's tutelage, so stamped their ambitions that they had no room for deeper thoughts? From this last solution she shrank. It made such an awfully solemn matter of personal responsibility. Yet when she saw the almost reverence in which they held this new mother's views of whatever pertained to outside life, she could not but feel that there had been stamped upon their hearts the belief that she who had reigned so long in the fashionable world knew all about the important things, and had shown them what they were. At least, Susan felt sure that, Could Ruth have realized the influences she possessed over the unformed minds of her two daughters, she would have shrunken from using it for trivialities. As for Ruth, the girls had become secondary matters to her. She had carried her point. She had proved that dress and attention to the many refinements of life would make a vast difference in these two. She had shown their father that it was through sheer neglect that they grew to be the painful trials which they were. She had proved to him that her course was the right one. There was no skeleton in their country home now to be avoided painfully. The girls were not perfect in deportment, it is true, but so rapid had been their advancement in certain ways, and so skillful was the brain which planned their outward adornings, that they might safely endure introductions as Judge Burnham's daughters in any circle where it was desirable to present them. Ruth felt, watching them, that even the famous criminal lawyer himself would never have recognized in them the two distressing specimens which he had characterized as discarded American help. She had shown her husband, also, that country life was not only endurable, but in many respects desirable. Indeed, so satisfied had he become with his lovely rural home, that, when it was announced as important for baby's health that the entire season should be spent there, he offered no objection, and agreed with alacrity to Ruth's plan that Susan should take the girls for a peep at life at Long Branch, and leave them to the solitude of home. "Very well," he had said, "provided you will, on their return, leave Susan in charge of his lordship, and run away with me to the mountains for a few days." And Ruth had laughed, and shrugged her handsome shoulders, and exclaimed over the folly of trying to coax a mother from her 6 months-old baby, for any mountains in the world. And then she had looked proudly over toward the lace-curtained crib, and rejoiced in the fact that the hero sleeping there had power enough to hold father as well as mother, a meek worshiper at his shrine. For, if Judge Burnham really was an idolater, his only son was the supreme idol in his inmost heart. So the summer plans were carried out. Ruth serenely discussed seaside outfits, and decided, with the tone of one who realized that her word was law, as to whether Minta would look better in a salmon-colored evening dress, and whether Seraph was too young for a satin-trimmed one. Long ago Susan, apparently without thought on the subject, had started the habit of softening the objectionable name into this euphonious one, and Ruth remarked to her husband that perhaps time would develop the fact that there was almost a prophecy in the name, if Seraph's voice continued to develop in strength and sweetness, under culture. On the whole, there was serene satisfaction in the survey of her handiwork where these girls were concerned. They bade fair to do justice to her discernment, and afford food for pride. Still, as I said, they were secondary. So that they were always well dressed, and sat properly at table, and entered a room properly, and bowed gracefully to her callers, and treated her with unfailing respect, she was at rest concerning them. Almost, she had so trodden her conscience under foot that in these days had she really very little trouble in the thought that her best for them had ignored the best which life had for any soul. Susan packed and arranged, and listened to her numerous directions, and went off to take her first summering away from cares, which of one sort or another had held her for a lifetime; went with a shade of anxiety on her face which was not for herself, nor yet because of her responsibility in regard to these two unfledged worldlings, but for the Christian mother hovering over the lace-curtained crib in the rose-hued nursery; and her heart went murmuring, "How will he speak to her next?" Not many days after, the next call of the shepherd came. You are prepared to hear what it was. That little, sheltered, watched-over baby fell sick. Not very sick, not so but that the doctor went and came with a cheery air, and told the anxious mother that they would have their darling as chirk as ever in a day or two, and Judge Burnham believed him, and laughed at the mother's dreary face, and made light of her fears. But poor Ruth did not believe him, and went about her mother cares, and hung over her sick darling with an ever-increasing, deadening weight at her heart. He was not the family physician of the Erskines, Dr. Mitchell. Judge Burnham didn't believe in him, so the coming and going doctor was the one associated with the dark days wherein they had waited and watched over Ruth's father. Whether it was that association, or whatever it was, Ruth shrank a little from Dr. Bacon, and was not able to give him her full confidence. Dark days were these, and they dragged their slow lengths along, and brought regularly the longer and darker nights, for it is at night that we hang most hopelessly over our sick, and the silence and quietness of the home grew oppressive to Ruth. She wished for Susan, she would gladly have had the girls coming and going, yet it seemed foolish to send for them. There was a skillful nurse, and there were neighbors, who, though they had been almost ignored by the fine family at the Hill, yet directly they heard that there was sickness, came and went with their thoughtful offers of assistance. Why, even Mrs. Ferris, with her loud voice and her uncouth ways, came and was welcomed by Ruth, because of the humble work which she did in the kitchen that tended to baby's comfort. And still the doctor came and went with his story that the baby would be all right in a few days. But the days of mending did not come, and the shadow deepened and darkened, though as yet it seemed to be seen only by the mother's heart, and in that heart a war was being waged, which in fierceness and length of conflict so far transcended all Ruth's other struggles with life as to make them pale into nothingness before her. And the struggle was such that no human heart could intermeddle, for it was between Ruth and God. She realized in those days that she had actually had many a struggle with the great God before, without recognizing it as such, or at least calling it by its right name. At first there was wild, fierce rebellion. She clung to her baby, held him indeed so fiercely that he wailed feebly, and looked up into her face almost in terror, and she cried out that she could not, indeed would not, give him up, no, not even to the giver. And the little face grew daily more wasted, and the little hands more feeble, and the moments of wakeful recognition shorter, and the hours of half stupor longer, and the doctor grew less cheery when he came, and Judge Burnham grew restless and nervous, went later every day to town, and returned earlier, and was, in his silent, restrained, yet passionate way, as rebellious as his wife. End of chapter 27. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 28 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 28. The Oil of Joy. Even yet the doctor had said no word of discouragement, and Judge Burnham had, though he had ceased laughing at Ruth's fears, sharply controverted them. And she? She felt she would have stricken down anyone who had breathed a word of danger. It was fearful enough to feel it. Let no one dare to speak it. Once when Judge Burnham, filled with pity for her loneliness during the hours when he was obliged to be away, suggested recalling the travelers, she turned toward him fiercely. "Why?" she asked him. "What do you mean? Are you keeping something from me? Does the doctor tell you what he does not me? Judge Burnham, I will never forgive you if you deceive me." "Why, no," he said. "Ruth, no. Why will you be so unreasonable? The doctor says he sees no ground as yet for special anxiety. He says to me just what he says to you. No one thinks of deception. I only felt that it would be less lonely with the girls at home, and Susan would be a comfort." "Comfort!" she said, still speaking sharply. "Why have I need of comfort? I have my baby, and I can take care of him; and as for loneliness, the house is full from morning till night. One would think people never heard of a sick child before. They are always sick when teething. Why should we be so unreasonably frightened?" And Judge Burnham turned away sighing, patient with his wife, for he saw that she was too wildly frightened to talk or act like a reasonable being. Among all the comers and goers there was one who did not come. That was Mrs. Judge Erskine. Not that she would not have willingly been there both day and night, but poor Ruth, who had never recovered in the least from her early discomfort concerning the woman, in this time of her frenzy felt the dislike increasing to almost hatred. She tortured herself at times with imagining the exclamations that the odious grandmother would make over the change in her darling, until at last it grew to be almost an insanity to her, and she fiercely ordered that no word of any sort should be taken to her home. Father shall not be needlessly troubled, was outward reason enough, for Judge Erskine was not strong this season. So, beyond the knowledge that the child was not very well, was teething, and kept Ruth closely at home, the two people left in the old Erskine homestead together knew nothing. Slowly yet surely, the shepherd was reaching after his stray sheep. By degrees her mood and her prayers changed. They lost their fierceness, but not one whit of their will power. She began to feel herself in the hands of God. She gave up her defiance, and came to him as a suppliant. She sat alone in the shadows of a long night of watching, and looked over her life, and saw plainly her mistakes, her wanderings, her sins. Then she fell on her knees beside that crib, one watching eye and listening ear intent on every change of expression or breathing in the darling, and then and there she proceeded to make terms with God. If he would only give her back her darling, her boy, she would live, oh, such a different life, a life of entire consecration. All she had, and was, and hoped to be, her husband, her baby, everything should be consecrated, and held second to his love. Long she knelt there praying, but no answering voice spoke peace to her heart. And the struggle, though changed in its form, went on and on by degrees, and Ruth, with her long preoccupied heart, was very slow to learn the lesson. She was made to understand that God had never promised to compromise with his own, never promised to hear a prayer which began with an "if." Entire consecration meant all the "ifs" thrown down at the feet of the Lord, for him to control as he would. Solemnly his voice spoke to her heart, spoke as plainly as though the sound of it had echoed in the silent room. And if I take your darling into my arms of infinite love, and shield him for you in heaven, what then? And Ruth realized with a shudder that then, her heart said it would only be infinite mercy that could keep her from hating God. But when she realized this solemn, this awful truth, which proved rebellion in the heart that had long professed allegiance, God be thanked that she did not get up from her kneeling and go away again with the burden. She knelt still, and, with the solemn light of the all-seeing eye flashing down into her soul, she confessed it all, her rebellion, her selfish determination to hold her treasure whether God would or not, her selfish desire to compromise, her cowardly, pitiful subterfuge of promising him that which was already his by right, if he would submit to her plans. The long, sad, sinful story was laid bare before him, and then her torn heart said, "Oh, Christ, I cannot help it. I hold to my darling, and I cannot give him up, even when I would. Oh, thou Savior of human souls, even in their sinfulness, what shall I do?" Did ever such heart cry go up to the Savior of souls in vain? You need not me to tell you that before the dawn of the coming morning filled the room, a voice of power had spoken peace. The plans, and the subterfuges, and the rebellings, and the ifs were all gone. "As thou wilt" was the only voice left in that thoroughly bared and bleeding heart. It was even then that the shadow fell the darkest. When the doctor came next morning, for the first time he shook his head. "Things do not look so hopeful as they did here," he said. And Judge Burnham, turning quickly toward his wife, looking to see her faint or lose her reason, he hardly knew which phase of despair to expect, saw the pale, changed face. "Is there no hope, doctor?" And her voice, though low, was certainly calmer than it had been for days. "Well," said the doctor, relieved at her method of receiving his warning, "I never like to say that. While there is life there is hope, you know, but the fact is, I am disappointed in the turn that the trouble has taken. I am a good deal afraid of results." Had Ruth spoken her thoughts, she would have said, "I have been awfully afraid of results for a week, but a voice of greater power than yours has spoken to me now. It rests with him, not you, and I think he wants my darling." What she did say was, "Ought the girls to be summoned?" "Well," said Dr. Bacon, regarding her curiously, "if it is important that they should be here, I think I should telegraph." Then, presuming upon long acquaintance with Judge Burnham, he said, as they passed down the hall together, "Upon my word, Burnham, you have the most unaccountable wife in the world." "Comments are unnecessary, Doctor," Judge Burnham said, in his haughtiest tones, and the next instant the front door closed with a bang, and the father had shut himself and his pain into the little room at the end of the hall. What was he to do? Which way turn? How live? He had never until this moment had other than a passing anxiety. Now the whole crushing weight of the coming blow seemed to fall on him, and he had not the force of habit, nor the knowledge of past experiences, to drive him to his knees for a refuge. Instead, his fierce heart raved. If Ruth had been in danger of hating God, he felt, yes, actually realized, that his heart was filled at this moment with a fierce and bitter hatred. Can you imagine what the trials of that day were to Ruth? Have you any knowledge of what a shock it is to a torn and bleeding heart, which yet feels that the Almighty Father, the everlasting Savior, holds her and her treasure in the hollow of his hand, to come in contact with one who fiercely, blasphemously tramples on that trust? In this moment of supreme pain, it was given to Ruth's conscience to remember that she had chosen for her closest friend one who made no profession of loyalty to her Redeemer, the lover of her child. Why should she expect to rest on him now? This day, like all the other dark ones, drew toward its closing. The doctor watched and waited for and dispatched for did not come, and the night drew about them. And so it happened that, save the nurse and the household servants, the father and mother were alone with their baby. Early in the afternoon, a sudden remembrance had come to Ruth, and she had turned from the crib long enough to say, "Let father know." And the messenger had gone, but even from him there was no response. So they watched and waited. Judge Burnham, in feverish madness of anxiety, paced the floor, and alternately raged at the absent doctor for not coming, and then wished he might never look upon his face again. Ruth stayed on her knees beside that crib, from which for hours she had not moved, and her lips continually formed that inaudible prayer, "Thy will be done." And really and truly the awful bitterness of the agony was gone out of her heart. There was a sound of wheels crunching the graveled drive. A bustle outside. Somebody had come. Ruth glanced up, half fearfully. What was coming to break the solemn holiness of the hour? Not the doctor, surely, with such a bustle of noise. The door opened quickly, and they pressed in, her father, a tall stranger just beside him, and Mrs. Judge Erskine. She pushed past them both. "Dear heart," she said, bending down to the crib, but her words were for Ruth, not the baby. "We just got the word. I brought Dr. Parmelee. I couldn't help it, child. I've seen him do such wonderful things. Your pa don't believe in his medicines, little bits of pills, you know, and he said your husband didn't, but, la, what difference does that make? Men never do. They believe in getting 'em well, though. Come here, Dr. Parmelee. His pulse is real strong, and he looks to me as though he might—" And here Mrs. Erskine paused for breath. She had been, in the meantime, throwing off her wraps, touching the baby's hand with skillful fingers, touching the hot head, and rising at last to motion the doctor forward, the tall stranger. He came hesitatingly, looking toward the father, but Judge Burnham caught at his name. "Anything, doctor, anything," he said, hoarsely. "Dr. Bacon has proven himself an idiot. It is too late now, but in heaven's name do something." Did it ever occur to you as strange that such men as Judge Burnham, in their hours of great mental pain, are very apt to call for blessings in heaven's name? It was a strange hour. Ruth, who had been hushed into silence and solemnity by the presence of the death angel, found herself whirled into the very midst of the struggle for life. Dr. Parmelee declared, with Mrs. Erskine, that there was still a good deal of strength, and he hoped. And then he stopped talking and went to work, quietly, skillfully, without commotion of any sort, yet issuing his orders with such swiftness and skill that mother and nurse, especially the former, were set to work to do instead of think. Especially was Mrs. Erskine alert, seeming to know with a sort of instinct, such as is noticeable in nurses who have a special calling for their work, what the doctor wanted done, and how to do it. Far into the night they obeyed and watched. At last the doctor rose up from a careful examination of his little patient. "I believe," he said, speaking quietly, "I believe there has been a change in the symptoms in the past 2 hours. If I mistake not, the crisis is past. I think your little one will recover." At the sound of these words, Judge Burnham strode over from his station at the head of the crib, and, grasping the doctor's hand, essayed to speak words, but his voice choked, and the self-possessed, polished gentleman lost every vestige of control and broke into a passion of tears. "He is in God's hands, my friend," the new doctor said gently. "He will do right; and I think he has given the little life back to you." As for Ruth, she turned one look away from her baby's face toward the doctor's, and he said as he went out from the home, "I declare that woman's eyes paid me to-night." There was little talk and much watching during the rest of the night and the day that followed. Mrs. Erskine kept her post, keeping up that sort of alert doing which the skillful nurse understands so well, and which thrills the heart of a watcher with eager hope. One of Judge Burnham's first morning duties was to send a curt and courteous note, if both terms are admissible, to Dr. Bacon, asking for his bill. Then his own carriage waited at the train for the coming of Dr. Parmelee. "Now, look here, child," said Mrs. Erskine, as, toward the midnight of the following night, Ruth turned for a moment from the crib and pressed her hand to her eyes, "you are just to go to bed and get a night's sleep. We'll have you on our hands if you don't, as sure as the world; and that will be a nice mess for baby, bless his heart. Judge Burnham, you just take her and put her to bed. I'm going to sit by my little boy here the whole blessed night. I won't even wink; and when I undertake to watch, why I watch, and know how, though I do say it that shouldn't." So, through much protesting from Ruth, and overruling by her father and husband, she was carried off to the room adjoining. In the gray dawn of another morning, she, having slept for 4 hours the sleep of utter exhaustion, started with a sudden, affrighted waking, wherein all the agony of the past days flashed over her, and, without waiting to remember the after scene of joy, rushed to her nursery. There was the little crib with its sleeping treasure. There on the couch lay the tired nurse, sleeping quietly. There, at the crib's side, sat Mrs. Erskine, keeping her faithful, tireless vigil. She looked up with a reassuring smile as Ruth came in. "What did you wake up for? He's as nice as a robin in a nest of down. He breathes just as easy; and the skin feels moist and natural. See how his little hair curls with the dampness. Anybody can see with half an eye that he is a great deal better. He'll get on now real fast, Dr. Parmelee says so. I never did see the like of them little pills. Ain't bigger than pinheads, neither." Ruth bent low over the crib. The bounding pulse was quiet and steady at last. The breath came in slow, soft respirations, with no horrible gratings. The beautiful little hand, resting on the pillow, was doubled up as in the grace in which he held it when in health. Suddenly there rushed over Ruth all the probabilities of that solemn night, and all the blessings of this hour. After she had given him up utterly to God, after she had said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust," after she had said, "I am thine forever, Lord, entirely, though with empty arms," then he had given her back her trust, offered her one more chance to train the soul for him. With the thought came also the remembrance of the door through which he had opened this blessed paradise of hope, and she turned suddenly and, burying her head in Mrs. Erskine's ample lap, cried out, "Oh, mother, mother! God bless you forever!" And the first tears that her tired eyes had felt for a week fell thick and fast. "Land alive!" said Mrs. Judge Erskine. "Poor dear heart! You are all tuckered out. You just go right straight back to bed. I won't turn my eyes away from him, and he's all right anyhow. I know the signs. Bless your heart, I nursed Mrs. Stevens' baby only last week, and this very Dr. Parmelee was there, and I saw what them little pills and powders could do when the Lord chose to use 'em. You just go back, dearie, this minute. You can sleep all day as well as not. Grandma'll take care of her blessed little darling, so she will." And Ruth went back to the bedside and to her knees, and among the sentences of her prayer that morning was this, from a full heart: "O God, I thank thee that, despite all the blindness and rebellion of my heart, thou didst send to me a mother. Thou hast given me the oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." End of Chapter 28. Recording by Trisha G. End of Ruth Erskine's Crosses, by Pansy.